Section 12 of Whitman, An Interpretation in Narrative by Emory Holloway. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 6, Part 1, 1. Increasing Purpose. The war was over. The returning private whom Whitman saw was not the forlorn individual of Hamlin Garland's sketch, suddenly stripped of his glamour and glory. He was in serried ranks, marching in review down the avenues of Washington. In that sight was a thrill which the individual soldier can never inspire. It seems to promise the perpetuation of a power recently displayed so terribly in battle. And Whitman, whose thought, now that the hospitals were emptying, turned to his favorite dream, sought to catch for future use the full dramatic significance of the moment. He realized that he at least would never see another like it. As your ranks, your immortal ranks, return from the battles, while the muskets of the young men yet lean over their shoulders, while I look on the bayonets bristling over their shoulders, while those slanted bayonets, whole forests of them appearing in the distance, approach and pass on, returning homeward, moving with steady motion, swaying to and fro to the right and left, evenly, lightly rising and falling as the steps keep time. Spirit of ours, I knew, all hectic red one day, but pale as death next day. Touch my mouth ere you depart, press my lips close. Leave me your pulses of rage, bequeath them to me, fill me with currents convulsive, let them scorch and blister out of my chance when you are gone. Let them identify you to the future in these songs. It was the average man in the army, as out of it, that had inspired him and enlisted his affection. By the end of 1865, however, nearly all the hospitals were gone from within and about Washington, and shoulder straps were less common on the streets. Whitman still devoted his Sunday afternoons to what soldiers remained to be cared for, but he suddenly found his exacting occupation gone. The war had exerted a salutary influence in dissipating without decreasing his passion for friends. Now he would find it returning upon him, his lifelong quest for friend and lover. It would still give him moments of sadness, even of torment, but the war had also weakened his vitality, and with it the strength of all his emotions, and had taught him, moreover, with his increasing years, to express his friendship in a more and more paternal manner. His next intimate friendship will reveal this, but before turning to it, let us see if nothing survives in him of the author of Enfants d'Adam. Whitman was markedly reticent about all his more personal affairs, a natural concomitant, perhaps, of the symbolical candor in his verse. Which was cause, which effect, the reader may judge, but though we do not know the subsequent history of his earlier adventure with woman, we do know that in Washington about this time he had an unhappy romantic attachment. Whether it began when his inamorata, like other women in the capital, seeing his Jovian form on the street or reading his verse in the parlor, sent him some tender missive, neither history nor tradition can say. We know only that they corresponded, and that one of her letters, betraying her feelings for Whitman, fell into her husband's hands. For unluckily she was encumbered with a husband, a rather jealous one at that, it would seem, for he flew into a rage and abused Walt violently. I'm often tempted to think that to a certain civilian was addressed to him as a parting shot. The lady appears to have been refined and gentle, and when she was touched with pity for Walt, he was ready to marry her, confirmed bachelor though he was, had she been free. The pathetic poem he sent to her, his most ideal love, we know. Out of the rolling ocean the crowd came, a drop gently to me, whispering, I love you, before long I die. I've traveled a long way merely to look on you, to touch you, for I could not die till I once looked on you, for I feared I might afterward lose you. Now we have met, we have looked, we are safe. Return in peace to the ocean, my love. I too am part of that ocean, my love. we are not so much separated. Behold the great rondure, the cohesion of all, how perfect! But as for me, for you, the irresistible sea is to separate us. As for an hour carrying us diverse, yet cannot carry us diverse forever. Be not impatient, a little space. Know you, I salute the air, the ocean, and the land. Every day at sundown for you, dear sake, my love. Surely he who could write so tenderly with such resignation to the laws of life as we know it here has learned something by experience in defying the irresistible sea. His love was its own excuse for being, yet he recognizes that even love is not always master of the ironies of one's personal destiny. The little that we know of this feudal connection comes to us through the memoirs of Mrs. O'Connor. With this family Whitman continued to be on the best of terms, dining with them regularly and basking in their unqualified admiration. Whitman was singularly fortunate not only in being able to attract people of intelligence and influence as friends, but without effort in enlisting their services in his behalf, and in behalf of the new American literature of which he looked upon himself as the founder. When Walt lost his position under Secretary Harlan, O'Connor was irate as only an Irishman with an education can be irate, eloquently. Though another clerkship was soon found for Whitman, this time in Humbly Ashton's own department, the Attorney General's, O'Connor could be satisfied by nothing less than the publishing of The Good Grey Poet, a pamphlet protesting against Harlan's action with such a flow of indignation as is not easily matched in the history of polemics. It is more like oratory, hot with personal feeling, piling up illustrations with sensational, if not always enduring effect, and sparing no epithets in its attempt to heap calumny on Harlan's devoted head. O'Connor's argument was that Whitman's life in the hospitals gave the lie to any imputation of bad character that might be based on his authorship of the Leaves, and that even if passages in his book, read alone, did prove offensive, the judgment of this book rests with the reader, not with any official inquisitor. At great length he culled passages from the classics to show that a consistent application of Harlan's punitive principles would condemn them all. Essentially, it was the argument of Milton's Areopagitica. Of course, O'Connor did not know all of Whitman's life, nor did he understand all the poetry which was the expression of that life. Whitman himself at this time would hardly have gone quite so far in its defense. Few modern readers would condemn Leaves of Grass because of a few blemishes. But this constitutes no reason, in morals or in art, why that which is falsely fragmentary should be defended per se. The best service done Whitman's fame by the brilliant effort of his friend, however, was its fixing upon him a fit and enduring sobriquet, the Good Grey Poet, a title which, it is interesting to note, was supplied by Whitman. To give his panegyric in another form, O'Connor 2 years later wrote a story, The Carpenter, in which the Christ role is given to Whitman. Other friends at this period began to come to Whitman's support, making of his literary fortune a holy cause. John Burroughs was now on intimate terms with this lover of nature who, like himself, had been strongly influenced by Emersonian ideas. Every Sunday Walt had breakfast at the Burroughs home, receiving such a welcome that even his habitual tardiness did not endanger his standing invitation. The Galaxy was now opening its pages to Whitman's verse and prose, and Burroughs printed in it a review of drum taps. In the next year, 1867, he issued in New York a booklet, Notes on Walt Whitman as Poet and Person, on which he had been laboring for some time. The special reason for its publication seems to have been a desire to promote the sale of Whitman's new edition of Leaves of Grass, later issues of which were to include Drum Taps and its sequel. Doubtless Burroughs, born to write, was glad to publish his first book, but when, after a long life of authorship in which he had written much about Whitman, he collected his works, he left this one out, probably for the reason that it was not wholly his. He had no information about Whitman that Whitman had not supplied him with, and perhaps half the book, including quotations, was actually written by the poet. The latter's anonymous self-criticisms of his first edition were now reappearing in another form. Whitman was so eager to get his book and his conception of America before the people that in his eagerness for his own success, which indeed was more the success of his mission than any mere personal profit, he seems to have forgotten something that was due to his young friend and to the reader of the notes. Later, Burroughs would do a much more ambitious book about his idol, but even there his criticism is fundamentally Whitman's conception of himself rather than the expression of an independent judgment. Whitman was obviously an intellectual and emotional planet, big enough to attract lesser minds out of their true orbits, nor did he see why he should blame himself for doing so. But the book was not an unrelieved eulogy for all that. As if to confess in a general way some of the misdeeds of his private life, which were open to criticism, Whitman has Burroughs to say that in youth he had sounded all the experiences of life with all their passions, pleasures, and abandonments. O'Connor's panegyric, to have been biographically accurate, should have taken these experiences into consideration as well as those of the Washington hospitals, but perhaps the overpraise in the good gray poet was what prompted this guarded confession in the notes, for Whitman loved the truth and, like the rest of us, spoke as much of it as he thought he could afford. Since we are primarily concerned with seeing Whitman himself as he makes his slow but increasing way through the middle of the 19th century America, it is fortunate that Burroughs, with his keen eye and graphic pen, has caught for us one of those little incidents which, though of constant occurrence with Whitman, nevertheless reveal the heart of the man as truly as the more theatric gestures of warrior or statesman. I give here a glimpse of him on a Navy Yard horse car, one summer day at sundown. The car is crowded and suffocatingly hot, with many passengers on the rear platform, and among them a bearded, florid-faced man, elderly but agile, resting against the dash by the side of the young conductor, and evidently his intimate friend. The man wears a broad-brimmed white hat. Among the jam, inside near the door, a young English woman of the working class, with 2 children, has had trouble all the way with the youngest, a strong, fat, fretful, bright babe of 14 or 15 months, who bids fair to worry the mother completely out, besides becoming a howling nuisance to everybody. As the car tugs around Capitol Hill, the young one is more demoniac than ever, and the flushed and perspiring mother is just ready to burst into tears with weariness and vexation. The car stops at the top of the hill to let off most of the rear platform passengers, and the white-hatted man reaches inside and gently but firmly disengaging the babe from its stifling place in the mother's arms, takes it in his own and out in the air. The astonished and excited child, partly in fear, partly in satisfaction at the change, stops its screaming, and as the man adjusts it more securely to his breast, plants its chubby hands against him, and pushing off as far as it can, gives a good long look squarely in his face, then, as if satisfied, snuggles down with its head on his neck, and in less than a minute is sound and peacefully asleep, without another whimper, utterly fagged out. A square or so more, and the conductor, who has had an unusually hard and uninterrupted day's work, gets off for his first meal and relief since morning, and now the white-hatted man, holding the slumbering babe, also acts as conductor the rest of the distance, keeping his eye on the passengers inside, who have by this time thinned out greatly. He makes a very good conductor, pulling the bell to stop or go on as needed, and seems to enjoy the occupation. The babe, meanwhile, rests its fat cheeks close on his neck and gray beard, one of his arms vigilantly surrounding it, while the other signals from time to time with the strap, and the flushed mother inside has a good half-hour to breathe and cool and recover herself. A strange type of bohemian, this, who, wherever he went among simple people, made the world his home and homelike. His own energies were not greatly taxed by the clerical duties whereby he made a comfortable living, but the surplus he gladly spent in easing the burden from weaker and less fortunate folk. It was not, however, with the impersonal philanthropy of the abolitionist, for, as he said, he gave not charity but himself. Few could resist the compliment of his friendship, least of all the young Irish conductor on this car. He was a friend with a special affinity for Walt. His name was Pete Doyle, who, as a Confederate prisoner paroled in Washington, had drifted into the employment of the streetcar company. He was 19 when Walt first met him in 1866. Doyle's account of this first meeting is none the less suggestive for his lack of education. The night was very stormy. He had been over to see Burroughs before he came down to take the car. The storm was awful. Walt had his blanket. It was thrown around his shoulders. He seemed like an old sea captain. He was the only passenger. It was a lonely night, so I thought I would go in and talk with him. Something in me made me do it, and something in him drew me that way. He used to say there was something in me had the same effect on him. Anyway, I went into the car. We were familiar at once. I put my hand on his knee. We understood. He did not get out at the end of the trip, in fact went all the way back with me. I think the year of this was 1866. From that time on, we were the biggest sort of friends. What could be the basis for such an unusual yet such an enduring friendship? With Eldridge or Burroughs or Ashton or Thoreau or Emerson or Conway or O'Connor, Whitman might have intellectual comradeship and ideal stimulation. Many were the feasts of reason at the O'Connor home, among spirits equally matched, possessing a common interest in world literature and affairs. Even Congressman James Garfield, later president, coming up behind Whitman on the street, would salute him with a quotation from his poetry. But Doyle could tell Whitman nothing he did not know, could understand little that he did. Between them there was, to be sure, the attraction felt by personalities fundamentally in tune. But that is much more akin to love than to friendship, and is subject to the vicissitudes of love. For enduring friendship, each friend must supply some need of the other, if the feeling is not to pass into indifference or patronage. But in the letters which were exchanged between Walt Whitman and Peter Doyle through many years, tokens of a friendship which was not broken till Doyle stood in 1892 at the graveside of his affectionate father and comrade, is trace of nothing humiliating on the part of either. As for Doyle, the service was companionship in a city of strangers, and more, it was the advice, encouragement, paternal interest of which his not very adventurous spirit stood in need. Whitman took charge of his savings like a father, advised him concerning his work and advancement, encouraged him to study, gave him relief on days of hard work, and after working hours took with him long walks on the beautiful moonlit roads about Washington. When together they were as careless of the decorous and conventional world about them as two schoolboys. If the fancy struck them, they would purchase a watermelon from a market wagon and sit down on the curb of the avenue to enjoy it, unmindful of the amused smiles of passers-by. Perhaps for Whitman there was in this even a secret enjoyment, for he knew the value of creating a role for himself in the public mind as a people's poet, and took delight in doing what poets who traded in respectability did not care or dare to do. For his part, Whitman found in this young friend an audience to his liking. Sometimes after Pete had come off duty, they would go to a cafe and call for their beer. Then Whitman would begin a discourse on the heavenly bodies. Presently he would find his companion sound asleep on the table, and like a mother unwilling to wake her weary infant, Whitman would stand guard over him till closing time. Perhaps his vanity was hurt by the discovery that this man taken at random from the people could not follow him into his poetic flights, giving small assurance that his verse would ever be popular with the masses. But it was also gratifying to be able to talk to his heart's content, like Dr. Johnson, without having to reply to the sharp question of an O'Connor or others trained in the schools. Chiefly, however, he found in Doyle someone to love. The hospitals were closed to him, and on Doyle he lavished the paternal affection which had given him so much noble pleasure during the war. Now and then there is a momentary outcropping of the old calamus feeling that a love so great as his could not be fully returned. But Doyle was so obviously wrapped up in his big friend, and so dependent upon him, that thoughts of jealousy could not last long. Nevertheless, though neither of them comprehended the psychology of their attachment for each other, Whitman had learned something through his long experience with such emotions, and at times felt that they should be carefully restrained. Once in his private notebooks he exclaimed, "Depress the adhesive nature. It is in excess, making life a torment. All this diseased, feverish, disproportionate adhesiveness. And he held up his own emulation, the example of the wise man of Epictetus, and the story of Merlin, strong and wise and beautiful at 100 years old. He was at his best with Doyle when in the presence of nature. There he would sing snatches from the operas, spout heroic speeches from Shakespeare, or indulge in thinking aloud on some of the many subjects which, as verse, were taking shape in his mind. It was not unlike the outpourings of a precocious, enthusiastic boy. Yet Whitman was no boy. He was now approaching the climax of maturity in his intellect and his art. For a few years, as he anticipated, he would cast his longest shadow on the pages of his books, and then fate would deal with him much as it had dealt with Lincoln. The years of disillusionment which quickly follow even a successful idealistic war are peculiarly trying to the idealist. The illusion of progress has so quickly passed into the reality of stupid reaction, wherewith pygmy politicians, no longer led by great statesmen or actuated by the fear and pride of war, seem determined to compensate themselves for the unwonted heroism which the national emergency has called forth. In morale, as in materials, war is always a mortgage on the future, and those who lack the imagination to dwell in that future are first to foreclose the mortgage. Nothing could have been more discouraging to Whitman, had he looked to government for the salvation of his country, than the incompetent administration of Andrew Johnson, following upon that of Abraham Lincoln. The whole Reconstruction policy, which made the worst of a disastrous war, must have depressed him deeply. It was a heated argument on the fitness of the late slaves to receive the ballot which caused a serious break in his friendly relations with O'Connor, the uncompromising abolitionist. But the philosophy on which Whitman relied in this discouraging period was securely rooted in his faith. It was the philosophy of Leaves of Grass, to which he now added a new meaning. During the war he had little time for thinking or writing about the future. He was too busy with personal service. But after a relatively fallow period, these new experiences demanded expression, this time in prose as well as in verse. In 1867 and in 1868 he had sent to the Galaxy essays on democracy and on personalism, treating of the paradox of individualism and social unity. By 1870 he issued pamphlet Democratic Vistas, and in which the Galaxy essays were none too deftly incorporated. Whitman had a bad habit of using what he had published for one purpose as a means to the accomplishment of quite a different purpose, and without altering its structure accordingly. This lack of careful revision is more apparent in his prose than his verse, and accounts in large measure for the neglect that has to this day met most of his prose, except the diary notes, which could only suffer by any revision. And this is most unfortunate, for if the reader has but patience to plough through many a turgid, mystical passage, he will come now and then upon paragraphs of prose as vibrant and as eloquent as anything in his verse. In the whole intention and spirit of the Vistas, coming in the dark days of American postbellum literature, one takes the measure of as devout and as knightly crusader as our literary history has to offer. More, he who is acquainted with what our publishers were then offering, and with what was soon to come from the new school of Western writers, Mark Twain, Joaquin Miller, Bret Harte, and the rest, will recognize in Whitman both a prophet and a leader. Lowell's simpler and better known address on democracy in Birmingham came a decade and a half later, yet repeated some of Whitman's arguments. The triumph of faith over despair, which makes the Vistas a significant milestone in the growth of Walt Whitman, inviting comparison with Carlyle's indictment of democracy in Shooting Niagara, which in part prompted the Vistas as a rejoinder, is the more noteworthy in a man who, had he not been creator, would certainly have been a satirist. We recall the bitter poem Répondez in the second edition, and Whitman's unqualified denunciation of the political systems just before the Civil War. And here in the Vistas reappears that note of America's failure when judged only by her past achievement, admitting not only the natural advantages and resources of America, but the phenomenal success of her pioneering spirit and inventive genius in all that concerns material civilization. He yet fails to see the type of personality he called for in the Leaves of Grass. Are there indeed men here worthy the name? Are there athletes? Are there perfect women to match the generous material luxuriance? Are there crops of fine youths and majestic old persons? Are there arts worthy of freedom and a rich people? Is there a great moral and religious civilization, the only justification of a great material one? Confess that to severe eyes, using the moral microscope on humanity, a sort of dry and flat Sahara appears in these cities crowded with petty grotesques, malformations, phantoms, playing meaningless antics. Confess that everywhere in shop, street, church, theatre, barroom, official chair, are pervading flippancy and vulgarity, low, cunning, infidelity, everywhere the youth puny, impudent, foppish, prematurely ripe, everywhere an abnormal libidinousness, unhealthy forms, male, female, painted, padded, dyed, chignoned, muddied complexions, bad blood, the capacity for good motherhood decreasing or deceased, shallow notions of beauty with a range of manners, or rather lack of manners, considering the advantages enjoyed, probably the meanest to be seen in the world. Did we not know the depth of Whitman's affection for his country, we should be tempted to set down such a description to spleen, or to some morbid projection of his own unhappiness, as similar indictments by foreign visitors, however competent, have commonly been attributed to racial or national jealousy. But this was his deliberate opinion. His was no cheap optimism. One who knows how recently Americans have ceased to suffer from dyspepsia as a national disease, to study the physiology and hygiene which Whitman urged, to treat women with the respect due to equals, to look upon art as an essential of life, to become a reading people, gradually learning to enjoy more and more substantial diet, can appreciate the Brobdingnagian scorn of Whitman, and for the plentiful little mannikins of his day, skipping around in collars and tailed coats. Satirical main streets are still in point, to be sure, and the sudden increase of wealth has thrown the character of the average man into painful contrast with his material possessions, but no one who looks upon the America of 1926 can fail to see much that appeared to Whitman only through the vistas of his imagination. Ah, Genoese! Thy dream, centuries after thou art laid in thy grave, the shore thou foundest verifies thy dream. Indeed, it was the consciousness of imperfection in the present, both in his environment and in his inner emotional life, that drove him to think of the future, and his dreams naturally bore in reverse the stamp of his particular wants. No more the animal exuberance of the first edition. He has come to knowledge of himself, of his land. He has found it necessary to discipline his personal emotions, even to impose upon himself a penance lest he sacrifice his soul, his self-reliance, by defying the inexorable decrees of his sometimes unhappy fate. And his solace comes, as it did to all the dreaming prophets and Puritans, in visions of a new heaven on a new earth. This was to be accomplished, he announced, by a new-founded literature, not merely to copy and reflect existing surfaces, or pander to what is called taste, not only to amuse, pass away time, celebrate the beautiful, the refined, the past, or exhibit technical, rhythmic, or grammatical dexterity, but a literature underlying life, religious, consistent with science, handling the elements and forces with competent power, teaching and training men, and perhaps the most precious of its results, achieving the entire redemption of woman out of these incredible holes and webs of silliness, millinery, and every kind of dyspeptic depletion, and thus ensuring to the states a strong and sweet female race, a race of perfect mothers. There is something a little pathetic in this book. The strong young prophet, whose barbaric yawp was to create a new style, a new objective for American writers, looking about after 15 years of earnest work and confident prophecy, finds little accomplished. He himself is without even a publisher. He begins to realize that, save only time and a few young champions, he is without allies. A premonition of an early eclipse of his powers steals upon his spirit. He even has doubts whether he has not too hastily ignored the assistance which merely technical art, had he possessed it, might have given him. Style is more important than he had thought, but it is now too late fundamentally to alter his style, so he calls upon others to carry forward the flaming torch which is to light his country toward its destined goal. Government is but machinery. There must be governors, and in a republic they must be the average man. Until such is the case, all is experiment. So, like Emerson, long before he calls upon the American scholar, writer, teacher to disseminate culture among the masses, the culture of the manly and courageous instincts and loving perceptions and of self-respect, His calamus idea now becomes not the mere indulgence in the emotions provoked by individuals as such, but running like a half-hid warp through all the myriad audible and visible worldly interests of America, threads of manly friendship, fond and loving, pure and sweet, strong and lifelong, carried to a degree hitherto unknown, not only giving tone to individual character and making it unprecedentedly emotional, muscular, heroic, and refined, but having the deepest relations to general politics. It is still friendship, but purged of its selfishness, its morbidity, its dross. It is the soul of the body politic. The individualist has been taught to live in a community. It can thus be seen that to Whitman's original idea of heroic, epic autobiography, celebrating the individual not only in himself but as a type of what the race might be, an epic in which the youth and overflowing health of the author by necessity laid most emphasis on the body and what depends on the body, he now adds a new message, the chant of the national soul. It is this which is to guide the new race of bards toward a common, unseen, far-off divine event, the prophetic vision, the joy of being tossed in the brave turmoil of these times, the promulgation of the path, obedient, lowly, reverent to the voice, the gesture of the God or Holy Ghost, which others see not, hear not, but with the proud consciousness that amid whatever clouds, seductions, or heart-wearying postponements we have never deserted, never despaired, never abandoned the faith. And when we turn to read the verse he was writing at this time, we are impressed anew with the fact that we have a different Whitman. Here is no longer the youthful feeling of immortality born of high animal spirits, nor even the agonized realism of the wartime verse. Here is the aspiration of the pioneer soul, taught by frustrated human hopes, if not disgust, yet a certain despair of realizing itself through union with another in this life. What is this separate nature so unnatural? What is this earth to our affections, unloving earth without a throb to answer ours, cold earth, the place of graves? The mystic survives in him. He makes rendezvous not with the great companions, but with the comrade perfect. There was in a notebook of 1862-3 a poem of the calamus type, comparing the spider throwing out experimental anchors of silk to the individual soldier seeking his proper comrade and lover. But when the poem was perfected in structure and published among the Whispers of Heavenly Death in 1871, it contained but one note, that of religious mysticism, the soul's outreaching for reality. A noiseless, patient spider I marked where, on a little promontory, it stood isolated, marked how to explore the vacant, vast surrounding. It launched forth filament, filament, filament out of itself, ever unreeling them, ever tirelessly speeding them. And you, O my soul, where you stand, surrounded, detached in measureless oceans of space, ceaselessly musing, venturing, throwing, seeking the spheres to connect them, till the bridge you will need be formed, till the ductile anchor hold, till the gossamer thread you fling catch somewhere, O my soul. With that peculiarly realistic mysticism which informs the first edition, he had begun by declaring, like Blake, divine am I, inside and out, I exist as I am, that is enough. But now as gods are ideals, by so much has his aspiring imagination outrun his personal growth. He sings, not the average man, but the ideal man, not life, but the unplumbed vistas of death, not identity, but the old cause of the amelioration of the race. In proud music of the storm, he comes very near reaching the climax of his technical skill, with marvelous smoothness, interpreting an actual storm, linking its various movements of sound to all the music he had ever heard, and finally realizing that the two have been harmonized, physical phenomenon and poetic memory, by something deeper than either, the Quaker's inner voice, the poet's light that never was on sea or land, in which are man and art with nature fused again. All the effects of operatic music are made use of in a harmony of sound till then unheard in America. One main theme in Democratic Vistas, it will be remembered, was the necessity that America should produce an original literature. In September 1871, Whitman was rather staggered to receive an invitation to deliver a poem at the opening of the annual exhibition of the American Institute in New York. He accepted, but Whitman could not command his inspiration even so well as Lowell did in his famous tour de force, the Commemoration Ode. Accordingly, he fell back upon ideas recently used in the Vistas. His stock of cardinal ideas was indeed small, though he was always keenly interested in new facts. Herein he was somewhat handicapped by the sort of newspaper training which had given bent to his thinking. In working over the democratic vistas in verse, therefore, he had to force his inspiration, and the result was as sad as the early catalogues had been. Indeed, he instinctively fell back on the catalogue method. Perhaps he realized how flat the verse was, and sympathized with the reader to a certain extent by deliberately parodying his own normal style. When the poem was published in a separate booklet, Whitman included a clipping from the Washington Chronicle about the occasion. Though unsigned, this was a letter from himself, still under the awkward necessity of being his own anonymous press agent. Imagine yourself, he wrote for the Family Chronicle, inside a huge barn-like edifice of a couple of acres, spanned by immense arches, like the ribs of some Leviathan ship, whose skeleton hull, inverted, the structure might be said to resemble, and this building crowded and crammed with incipient displays of goods and machinery, everything that grows and is made, and the 1,000 men actually engaged at work, in their shirt-sleeves, putting the said goods and machinery in order, all with a noise, movement, and variety, as if a good-sized city was in process of being built. In the middle of this, to an audience of perhaps 2,000 or 3,000 people, with a fringe on the outside of 500 or 600 partially hushed workmen, carpenters, machinists, and the like, with saws, wrenches, or hammers in their hands, Walt Whitman last Thursday gave his already celebrated poem before the American Institute. His manner was at first sight coldly quiet, but you soon felt the magnetism and felt stirred. His great figure was clothed in gray, with white vest, no necktie, and his beard was unshorn as ever. His voice is magnificent, and is to be mentioned with nature's oceans and the music of forests and hills. His gestures are few but significant. Sometimes he stands with his hands in his breast pockets. Once or twice he walked a few steps to and fro. He did not mind the distant noises and the litter and machinery, but doubtless rather enjoyed them. He was perfectly self-possessed. His apostrophe to the stars and stripes which floated above him, describing them in far different scenes in battle, was most impassioned. Also his away with war itself, and his scornful away with novels, plots, and plays of foreign courts. A few allusions of his poems were in playful tone, but the main impression was markedly serious, animated, and earnest. He was applauded as he advanced to read, besides several times throughout, and at the close. He did not respond in the usual way by bowing. All the directors and the officers of the Institute crowded around him and heartily thanked him. He extricated himself, regained his old Panama hat and stick, and without waiting for the rest of the exercises, made a quiet exit by the steps at the back of the stand. The real audience of this chant of peace, invention, and labor, however, was to follow. Of the New York and Brooklyn evening and morning dailies, 12 out of 17 published the poem in full the same evening or the next morning. What a setting for a Whitman poem on American industry! Who else, except Joaquin Miller, would have been so little disturbed by that setting? How he had watched himself and the impression he was making, the boy writer for the magazines, adoring the last of the sacred army of revolutionary heroes, now delights in believing himself adored, and not satisfied with the courtesy of the press in giving him ample space, he must describe it for himself. It was the American way of creating a pose, as though an old Panama hat had more poetic virtue in it than a new one. And yet it is only fair for us to remember that there were many Whitmans. If the poet in him read the poem, the journalist in him wrote up the occasion. It was characteristic of his perennial, if not always endearing, childishness that the two Whitmans were not at enmity with each other. About the same time Whitman was invited to deliver a poem at the commencement of Dartmouth College. The invitation seems to have originated with certain students who thought, by inviting a radical poet, to have fun at the expense of the more conservatively orthodox Congregationalists of the faculty. Of this, of course, Whitman was unaware. He took it all as a bona fide tribute to his growing fame as a national poet, and conducted himself accordingly. He continued to act that part as he had long conceived it. The poem, as a strong bird on pinions free, monotonously read from type, made no impression on Dartmouth, though Whitman's personal charm ensured for him cordial entertainment. But Whitman, who had abandoned his earlier professed attitude of letting his verse make its own way, cheerfully waiting for his recognition, again called upon his press agent himself to make the most of the occasion. Doubtless he wrote nothing he did not believe, and desired perhaps less to push his book than to explain it as he believed others would not or could not. Yet his tendency to coin hope into fact, to make use of friendly journals to review himself anonymously, is a little pathetic in its disclosure of his lack of the Olympian patience he wished others to believe his, and in its revelation, doubtless against all his expectation, of a certain tendency to deception. A few passages from this review, which, though sent to the press, seems not to have appeared in print after all, will indicate the discouragement in his soul at his poetic prospect, a discouragement which was most poignant when he assumed his most optimistic pose. The late Dartmouth College utterance of the above-named celebrities again arousing attention to his theory of the poet's art, and its exemplification in his writings, an intellectual career steadily pressing its way amid strong impediments through the past 16 or 17 years, and evidencing itself during that time in the good-sized volume of poems, Leaves of Grass, and the small prose book, Democratic Vistas, shows no sign of flagging energy in its late effusions, the American Institute poem, the cheering apostrophe to France, or in this college commencement piece, As a Strong Bird on Pinions Free, which, with some others, forms the first installment of a new volume just published. As the forced emphasis betrays, this flagging imagination is just what these late effusions do show, as if to make up for want of commanding example. Whitman again explains his theory, which original poets too often confuse with their proper business. He unblushingly announces the immediate growth of his fame, as he had long before told Emerson of the rapid sale of his first edition. Expectation is even now more and more stimulated, and already by a few of the boldest prophets some very audacious speculations are launched forth. Time only can show if there is indeed anything in them. This Walt Whitman, the queer one whom most of us have watched with more or less amusement walking by, this goer and comer for years about New York and Washington, good-natured with everybody like some farmer or mate of some coasting vessel, familiarly accosted by all, hardly any one of us stopping to Mr. him. This man of many characters, among the rest that of volunteer help in the army hospitals and on the field during the whole of the late war, carefully tending all the wounded he could, Southern or Northern, if it should turn out that in this plain, unsuspected old customer, dressed in gray and wearing no necktie, America and her Republican institutions are possessing that rara avis, a real national poet, chanting, putting in form in her own proud spirit, first-class style for present and future time, her democratic shapes, even as the bards of Judah put in song for all the time to come, the Hebrew spirit and Homer, and the war life of prehistoric Greece, and Shakespeare, the feudal shapes of Europe's kings and lords. Whether or not the future will justify such extravagant claims of his admirers, only that future itself can show, but Walt Whitman is certainly taking position as an original force and new power in literature. We are accustomed, of course, to think that such words would sound better in other mouths, in O'Connor's and Burroughs, for instance, and so they would and did. And yet the thing which kept Whitman at his poetic task was his frank faith in himself, his genuine admiration for his achievements of poetry and friendship, and it would be unfair not to remember that in him remained, as in most men of genius, some of the engaging naivete of the boy. We smile good-naturedly at the lad who, eager to be a man, proudly displays his biceps, but he laughs best who laughs last, and none can deny that, gambling on his own immortality, Whitman has certainly now begun to collect his winnings from that lady of fortune, the future. But for his confidence, or if one prefer overconfidence, which nevertheless was more in his words than in his inmost heart, American literature would today be without its most commanding figure. If any one, the poet must be allowed the defect of his qualities. End of section 12. Section 13 of Whitman, an interpretation in narrative by Emory Holloway. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 6, Part 2, 1. Increasing Purpose. But confidence is not creation. And had Whitman not written lines fit to live, we should not today be recalling the vagaries of his genius. If the American Institute poem and the Dartmouth commencement effort, taken with his press descriptions of himself, seem to indicate that he is failing as a poet, we must hasten to place beside Proud Music of the Storm a poem which he declared to contain more of his real spiritual autobiography than any other he ever wrote. I refer, of course, to Passage to India, ostensibly an occasional poem celebrating the almost simultaneous completion of the Suez Waterway to the east and the Transcontinental Railway to the west. These final achievements of man's effort to subdue the earth into a human community through which a single blood could course in the arteries of travel and commerce were but a material symbol of his own lifelong dream of the brotherhood of man. It was more than that. It was the mystic passion for the union of the past and the future in an eternal present. The whole span of evolution was to be glimpsed as easily as the radio encompasses the globe. Passage to India, not for spice and gems, but to the elder land of wisdom and art, where are the towers of fables immortal, fashioned from mortal dreams. The perpetual epic of Ulysses, the explorer, scientist, inventor, empire builder, can be justified only by one who will soothe with a hint of eternity the hearts as of fretted children which have tormented men since the expulsion from Eden, by one who will at last find a passage to the land of heart's desire. All affection shall be fully responded to, the secret shall be told, all these separations and gaps shall be taken up and hooked and linked together. The whole earth, this cold, impassive, voiceless earth, shall be completely justified. Trinitas divine shall be gloriously accomplished by the true Son of God, the poet. He shall indeed pass the straits and conquer the mountains. He shall double the Cape of Good Hope to some purpose. Nature and man shall be disjoined and diffused no more. The true Son of God shall absolutely fuse them. Identifying himself with this true Son of God, the poetic soul, he would be off, as in the wondrous days of 1855, with his vision. O soul, repressless, I with thee, and thou with me. Thy circumnavigation of the world begin, of man the voyage of his mind's return to reason's early paradise, back to wisdom's birth, to innocent intuitions again, with fair creation. Oh, we can wait no longer, we too take ship, O soul, joyous we too launch out on trackless seas, fearless for unknown shores, on waves of ecstasy to sail, amid the wafting winds, thou pressing me to thee, I thee to me, O soul, caroling free, singing our songs of God, chanting our chant of pleasant exploration. But sailing so far into the past, one at length confronts the future, the infinite. Sail forth, steer for the deep waters only, reckless, O soul, exploring, I with thee and thou with me, for we are bound where mariner has never yet dared to go, and we will risk the ship, ourselves and all. O my brave soul, O farther, farther sail, O daring joy, but safe are they not all the seas of God? O farther, farther, farther sail. This spirit of spiritual discovery, of absolute faith, links Whitman with the genius of American pioneering history and explains his dauntless confidence in himself and in the average man. It links him, moreover, with the great lovers, prophets, liberators of mankind. In this poem and in The Mystic Trumpeter and The Prayer of Columbus, soon afterwards to be published, Whitman sings his noblest, his purest note, and his real swan song. For though he is to live and write for 20 years more, a great affliction will soon touch body and mind. The rest will be late afternoon. Yet there will be compensations. His Leaves of Grass grew from hardy, democratic, universal roots, and now those roots begin to spread. Other hands will water them till they shall have refreshed with their greenness every part where poets dwell. The history of that influence is the story of a book, and requires a book to tell it. We shall limit ourselves to that part of it which, will throw light upon what remains to relate of the story of Walt Whitman. The transplantation of the grass seeds was most natural. Even the first edition had in some cases been sent by American readers, like Emerson and Thoreau, to friends in England. When Moncure Conway went to England, he took with him his personal memories and his great admiration for Whitman, with whom he maintained a correspondence. In 1866 he had written a long and favorable, if somewhat diffident, article on Whitman for the Fortnightly Review. Shortly afterwards he was laboring with other enthusiastic young English writers to bring Whitman to notice of the English public through reviews and an English edition. As early as 1858, a German-American friend of Whitman, working with him on the Brooklyn Times, had attempted to translate Whitman's verse into German, desisting only when he found himself unequal to the task. In 1868, Ferdinand Freiligarth wrote an article and made translations from Leaves of Grass in the Augsburg Allgemeine Zeitung, praising Whitman as a modern universal poet. 3 years later, Edward Dowden took the lead among a group of Dublin admirers in advertising the new poet through an article on the poetry of democracy in the Westminster Review, as a few months later Thérèse Benson was to praise him with characteristic French discrimination in the pages of the Revue des Deux Mondes, and Rudolf Schmidt in Copenhagen translating and reviewing. With most of these Whitman was in correspondence, sometimes furnishing himself the material on which their articles were based, but our story is concerned chiefly with the friends he was making in England. He sent an autographed copy of the Leaves to Tennyson, the Tennyson whose youthful Maud Whitman had anonymously reviewed, in contrast to his own just published first edition, much to the disparagement of the former. Tennyson replied kindly, inviting Whitman to visit him on the Isle of Pines. The British poet found in Whitman a great big something which he could not define, but doubtless liked him all the more for being so different from himself. Sir John Addington Symonds, the Oxford aesthete, whose overdeveloped scholarship, coupled with his frail body and unfortunate emotional organization, placed him in urgent need of the cosmic religious life which Whitman could inspire, no less than of the sane and well-rounded life in the presence of nature which Whitman taught. Concluding a beautiful and penetrating study of Whitman, published a year after the latter's death, Symonds testified to what Whitman's verse had done for him personally. He taught me to comprehend the harmony between the democratic spirit, science, and that larger religion to which the modern world is being led by the conception of human brotherhood and by the spirituality inherent in any real scientific view of the universe. He gave body concrete vitality to the religious creed which I had been already forming for myself upon the study of Goethe, Greek and Roman Stoics, Giordano Bruno, and the founders of the evolutionary doctrine. He inspired me with faith and made me feel that optimism was not unreasonable. This gave me great cheer in those evil years of enforced idleness and intellectual torpor which my health imposed upon me. Moreover, he helped to free me from many conceits and pettinesses to which academic culture is liable. He opened my eyes to the beauty, goodness, and greatness which may be found in all worthy human beings, the humblest and the highest. He made me respect personality more than attainments or position in the world. Through him I stripped my soul of social prejudices. This obviously is a religious result, and in so far justifies Whitman in his repeated assertion that Leaves of Grass is primarily a religious deliverance. Yet there was mixed with it a strange and pathetic element, which, when understood, helps to account for this widely read scholar's devotion to a single book, and demonstrates likewise an element in Whitman's not wholly religious. The tragic peculiarities of Symonds' emotional nature are well known. It was doubtless these peculiarities which led him to his masterful studies in Greek and Renaissance literature, and his book on Whitman, taken with his letters to his American idol, indicate that it was the Calamus poems which meant most to him. For in these poems he thought he recognized a kindred but more heroic spirit, and in them he glimpsed a possible spiritual sublimation of emotional tendencies which to his highly civilized intelligence were, when observed in themselves, obnoxious. When much later he suggested this interpretation to Whitman, the latter was at first evasive and finally defiant, denying any such fundamental kinship in their natures, and even going so far as to make a confession, itself of necessity painful, to his younger disciple. This, he doubtless thought, would prove the denial. The confession was nothing less than that. Though unmarried, he was the father of children from whom he had been separated by considerations of their interest and fortune. The heat which Whitman displayed in discussing the questions of Symonds betrays a buried fear which he had thought the experiences of the war had killed outright, and betrays also the fact that he had perhaps cultivated a profound ignorance of his own psychological make-up. His moods he would study and express with little reserve, but analyze them he could not, nor did he encourage others to do so. That might have inhibited the expression which gave him his chief relief. Indeed, the questions of Symonds should have been put before the publication of the 1860 edition. Whitman's post-war determination to emphasize the spiritual elements of life, as we have seen, shows how definitely he had himself turned his back on the less wholesome elements in some of the Calamus poems. But the law of compensation makes no allowance for the young poet's lack of circumspection, rendering the dross of his lines as long as a literary life as his more satisfying sentiments. Another who was introduced to Whitman in the 1860s was Swinburne, acutely sensitive to the feelings on the part of many Victorians that England was decadent, and himself singing in rapid alliterative lines, which but half concealed the despair in the heart of the poet. Swinburne at first was shocked into hope by Whitman's youthful confidence, notwithstanding his artistic deficiencies. In Songs Before Sunrise he published his tribute to Walt Whitman in America. Send but a song over sea for us, heart of their hearts who are free, heart of their singer to be for us more than our singing can be. Ours in the tempest dead era, with no light but the twilight of terror, send us a song over sea. Sweet smelling of pine leaves and grasses, and blown as a tree through and through, with the winds of the keen mountain passes, and tender as sun-smitten dew. Sharp-tongued as the winter that shakes the wastes of your limitless lakes, wide-eyed as the sea lines blue. It was comforting to Whitman, who had in a way not only turned his back on the technical masters of poetry, but had even defied them, to receive such praise from one of these masters. He could not know, of course, that Swinburne would later recant to the extent of publishing in the Fortnightly a severe criticism of Whitman's art and philosophy. By that time, however, Whitman would not need the endorsement of a Swinburne, and could dismiss the incident with the amused and quite impersonal remark, "Ain't he the damnedest simulacrum?" The artist William Bell Scott, who had first shown the Leaves of Grass to Swinburne, also introduced it to William Rossetti. Like Symonds, Rossetti was repelled by Whitman's occasional want of taste, and knew what Houghton, the publisher, was to tell him, that it would be legally impossible to reprint the Leaves in England without some form of suppression for these frank passages. Disliking expurgation as a form of poetic mutilation, he nevertheless desired England to know Whitman, and therefore determined to bring out a volume of selections from which would be omitted entirely any poem, though otherwise fine and unobjectionable, which contains any of his extreme crudities of expression in the way of indecency. This was in 1867. When advised of the project, Whitman was no more willing to authorize an expurgated edition in England than in America. He would have considered that not only weak and unmanly, but untrue to himself and to his mission. He did not object, however, to Rossetti's editing a volume of selections on his own responsibility, and in this his native stubbornness was yielding to wise advice. It was, to be sure, not adopting the course advised by Emerson 7 years before, but it was going half-way. Whitman's very appreciable following in England from that day to this can largely be attributed to the good sense of his tactful English editor. Squeamish American readers, which term in Whitman's day included most American readers, had no similar opportunity to approach Whitman through his best work alone. It so happened also that the Rossetti selection was the medium of bringing our poet yet another rare tribute different from any yet. 2 years after his volume was published, Rossetti received one day in June a letter from his friend Mrs. Anne Gilchrist, the gifted widow of Blake's biographer and the friend of Tennyson and later of the Carlyles. "I was calling on Maddox Brown a fortnight ago," she said, "and he put in my hands your edition of Walt Whitman's poems. I shall not cease to thank him for that. Since I have had it, I can read no other book. It holds me entirely spellbound, and I go through it again and again with deepening delight and wonder." Rossetti was delighted and lost no time in making reply. "Your letter has given me keen pleasure this morning. That glorious man Whitman will one day be known as one of the greatest sons of earth, a few steps below Shakespeare on the throne of immortality." What a tearing away of the obscuring veil of use and want from the visage of man and of life! I am doing myself the pleasure of at once ordering a copy of the selections for you, which you will be so kind as to accept. Genuine, that is, enthusiastic appreciators are not so common, and must be cultivated when they appear. Anybody who values Whitman as you do ought to read the whole of him. With remarkable enthusiasm, Mrs. Gilchrist sat down the same day again to write to Rossetti. "There is nothing in him that I shall ever let go my hold of. For me, the reading of his poems is truly a new birth of the soul. I shall quite fearlessly accept your kind offer of the loan of a complete edition, certain that great and divinely beautiful nature could not infuse any poison into the wine he has poured out for us. And as for what you specially allude to, who's so well able to bear it, I will say, to judge wisely of it, as one who, having been a happy wife and mother, has learned to accept all things with tenderness, to feel a sacredness in all. Perhaps Walt Whitman has forgotten, or through some theory in his head has overridden the truth that our instincts are beautiful facts of nature as well as our bodies, and that we have a strong instinct of silence about some things. Bringing to a reading of Whitman a faith like his own, that the new science would, when approached in a religious spirit, open new opportunities for the poet to link reality with the soul, and with Blake's mystical treatment of good and evil fresh in her mind, she was prepared to read the deleted poems by the light that glows out of the rest of the volume. Madame Blanc would have considered equally just that criticism which would read the rest of the book in their light. But Mrs. Gilchrist was not a critic. She was an acceptor, a devotee. There is a certain possessive quality, a personal element, in a woman's acceptance. To be sure, the mysticism of Whitman stimulated and satisfied her mind. "If the man of science is happy about the atoms," she wrote Rossetti, "if he is not balked or baffled by apparent decay or destruction, but can see far enough into the dimness to know that not only in each atom imperishable, but that its endowments, characteristics, affinities, electric and other attractions and repulsions, however suspended, hid, dormant, masked, when it enters into new combinations, remain unchanged, be it for thousands of years, and when it is again set free, manifest themselves in the old way, shall not the poet be happy about the vital whole? Shall the highest force, the vital, that controls and compels into complete subservience for its own purposes the rest, be the only one that is destructible? And the love and thought that endow the whole be less enduring than the gravitating chemical electric powers that endow its atoms? But she is not lost in the abstractions of her thought. Her emotions are still more powerful. She adds, "But identity is the essence of love and thought. I still I, you still you." And she is moved by her emotional stress as if a pent-up force were suddenly released, to have the temerity to read Whitman's book not only as an open letter to a friendly world, but as a personal advertisement for a special love. "I loved a certain person ardently, and my love was not returned. Yet out of that I've written these songs." Whitman had written, and Mrs. Gilchrist denied by fate the high companionship and intimacy for which she knew herself exceptionally fitted, cast off discretion, and allowed herself to believe that fate had been reserving her, not only to appreciate the purity of intent which actuated the author of Leaves of Grass, but to be the mate of the man who had so strangely identified himself with that book. A proper delicacy restrained the impulse to write Whitman at once, telling him that his messenger dove had sighted land in England, but she did write all she dared to Rossetti, who quoted therefrom to O'Connor. When the letter was shown to Whitman, he was doubly elated. "I'm deeply touched by these sympathies and convictions coming from a woman, and from England," he wrote Rossetti, "and I'm sure if the anonymous lady knew how much comfort it had been to me to get them, she would not only pardon you for transmitting them, but approve that action." I realize, indeed, of this smiling and emphatic well done from the heart and conscience of a true wife and mother, and one too whose sense of the poetic, as I glean from your letter, after flowing through the heart and conscience, must also move through and satisfy science as much as the aesthetic, that I had hitherto received no eulogium so magnificent. Truly he had not, for his American admirers knew the man as well as the book, in some cases knew the book chiefly through the man, whereas Mrs. Gilchrist, with only the book before her, had gone farther than they. O'Connor had apologized for Whitman. Mrs. Gilchrist praised him as only a woman can praise the man she loves. Whitman, never quite at his ease about the Children of Adam poems, thought that such an effect upon such a woman settled the matter for all time. They would do as he had intended them to do. It was characteristic of his type of mind that he should himself have read into these poems not merely the youthful impulses out of which they were born, but the religious aspirations which succeeded. But he was somewhat hasty in concluding that Mrs. Gilchrist's eulogy was conclusive, or her case typical. Naturally prejudiced by his long-deferred hope, he cannot be blamed for seeing in her in the type of perfect reader he was writing for. He could not know how charged with personal meaning were her words about his frankness of expression. Now none need turn away their thoughts with pain or shame, though only lovers and poets may say what they will, the lover to his own, the poet to all, because all are in a sense his own. So little suspecting what would come of it, Whitman sent to the anonymous lady by Rossetti a photograph of himself, and even suggested that his letter be given her if she wanted it. She dared to hope that the missive was in some way personal, and gladly consented to work over her letter to Rossetti into an article to be published in America. And that article was intended as a love letter. Whitman was staggered at the warmth of its praise, being, as he said, unused to it, but engrossed in its bearing on his poetic career. He did not yet suspect that in it a lady was taking her only opportunity to let him know that through his book she had fallen in love with him, at least with her image of him. A Woman's Estimate of Walt Whitman appeared in the Boston Radical for May 1870, but the hoped-for advances from Whitman did not come, and the English lady, pining for some one to love and finding none so close to her ideal as Whitman, poured out her soul to his portrait for more than a year. At length able to stand this ingrowing passion no longer, she convinced herself that she should write to him frankly concerning her history and her feeling toward him. If we may forget that she herself, though not without struggle, was doing violence to one of the instincts which are beautiful facts of nature, we can perceive in this letter the very sublimity of love. Alas, for her it is an instinct in man to be shy when woman grows forward, however sincerely she may do it, and by this time Whitman knew perfectly well the difference between the fair creatures of his imagination and the women whom he loved. He had just sworn off in his private notebooks from his futile pursuit of some inamorata which he recognized as undignified in him, and he was not likely to invite disaster again. We may not here quote her whole letter that were to wrest it from its appropriate setting, but a single passage will indicate that she was proposing marriage to Whitman. In May 1869 came the voice over the Atlantic to me, oh, the voice of my mate. It must be so. My love rises up out of the very depths of the grief and tramples upon despair. I can wait any time, a lifetime, many lifetimes. I can suffer, I can dare, I can learn, grow, toil, but nothing in life or death can tear out of my heart the passionate belief that one day I shall hear that voice say to me, my mate, the one I so much want, bride, wife, indissoluble, eternal. It is not happiness I plead with God for. It is the very life of my soul. My love is its life. Dear Walt, it is a sweet and precious thing, this love. It clings so close to the soul and body, all so tenderly dear, so beautiful, so sacred. It yearns with such passion to soothe and comfort and fill thee with sweet, tender joy. It aspires as grandly, as gloriously as thy own soul, strong to soar, soft and tender to nestle and caress. If God were to say to me, see, he that you love you shall not be given to in this life. He is going to set sail on the unknown sea. Will you go with him? Never yet has bride sprung into her husband's arms with the joy with which I would take thy hand and spring from the shore. It seems heartless to analyze so beautiful an avowal, but to do so will explain the sequel as nothing else can. It requires little experience in the self-deceptions of the hungry human heart to perceive that Mrs. Gilchrist is really writing her letter to herself, seeking by unqualified avowal to convince herself of the reality of that which during the year of silence must often have presented itself to her judgment as an illusion. She says she can wait, but the letter shows that she cannot. She says it is a mating of souls she craves, but she proposes marriage. She was in love, no doubt, and had all the symptoms of a first love in evidence, but with whom? Not the real Walt Whitman, of course, for him she had never seen. And if she found in his Leaves of Grass more vital suggestions of a personality than she had discovered in any other book, yet even there she distorted the real man by idealizing the very passages which, to prevent idealization and parasitic adulation, Whitman had courageously inserted. Nearly 2 months passed and no answer. The suspense was excruciating, for she was too intelligent not to know that she had risked much. She would write again. Could he have failed to receive her letter? Could that missive have fallen into other hands? Would he not at least let her know that he had heard from her, and thus spare her the needless suffering of uncertainty? Did he resent advances from her? He was himself making the advances, she tried to persuade herself. It is not true that thou hast not sought or loved me, for when I read the divine poems I feel all folded round in thy love. I feel often as if thou wast pleading so passionately for the love of the woman that can understand thee, that I know not how to bear the yearning tenderness that fills my breast. If never before, Whitman must now have realized the dangers that lie in attempting to confuse the man and the writer as he had done. Her reasoning, though specious enough in itself, was an argumentum ad hominem, so far as he was concerned. Coming to see that Mrs. Gilchrist was a lover rather than a disinterested admirer of his book, Whitman considered how best to prevent her from wounding herself with her passion. He had himself suffered too much from unreturned affection not to be gentle with such a noble, if deluded, soul. And just as in his dirge on Lincoln he had found death to be cool and enfolding, so he knew that on earth death's shadow silence may be the gentlest of answers, silence which can be interpreted by each according to his peculiar needs. But it was now obvious that silence would not be taken as an answer, so he wrote a brief reply, so carefully worded and proportioned, so delicate in its necessary refusal, that it was among the masterpieces of his spirit. It could have been written only by one who could meet Cardinal Newman's definition of a gentleman as one who never willingly gives pain. Washington, D.C., November 3, 1871. I've been waiting quite a while for time and the right mood to answer your letter in a spirit as serious as its own, and in the same unmitigated trust and affection. But more daily work than ever has fallen to me to do the present season, and though I am well and contented, my best moods seem to shun me. I wish to give to it a day, a sort of Sabbath or holy day, apart to itself under serene and propitious influences, confident that I could then write you a letter which would do you good and me too. But I must at least show without further delay that I am not insensible to your love. I too send you my love, and do you feel no disappointment because I now write so briefly? My book is my best letter, my response, my truest explanation of all. In it I have put my body and spirit. You understand this better and fuller and clearer than any one else. And I too fully and clearly understand the loving letter it has evoked. Enough that there surely exists so beautiful and a delicate relation, accepted by both of us with joy. Never was the double entendre used with more kindness. The lady has betrayed herself. The gentleman will afford her an easy retreat by putting an obviously false construction on her words. She has cited his book as a love letter. Very well, then, let it remain his love letter. Subtlety was a weapon Whitman had used for a long while, for did he not at times have to play hide-and-seek with his own deepest desires? But even on the receipt of this letter, Mrs. Gilchrist will not face the truth. She reasons that Whitman has never received her letter, or he would have answered a plain proposal plainly. And yet she has been rebuffed. and she knows it. She takes counsel of hope. I can wait, she says. I can grow great and beautiful through sorrow and suffering, working, struggling, yearning, loving so, all alone, as I have now done nearly 3 years. It will be 3 in May since I first read the book, first knew what the word love meant. To fill in the waiting periods, she gossips about her interests or his. She cannot bear the idea of breaking off the correspondence. Whitman replies infrequently, and then taking care to express as much interest in her children as in herself. About this time came Tennyson's invitation to visit him, and Whitman mentions it with the suggestion that another inducement to his accepting would be the opportunity to see her and her children. But it is a dream only, he adds, and except for a gossipy letter or two the next month, Whitman writes no more for nearly a year. But Mrs. Gilchrist's love proves greater than her pride, and she continues to write, "Shall you never find it in your heart to say a kind word to me again, or a word of some sort?" But she had an enemy she knew not of. That very month Whitman was stricken with paralysis. The reader will remember that in 1864, after a year and a half of hospital visiting, Whitman broke down. He regained his robustness of spirit, but never was quite the physically perfect man again. After a time he began to suffer from spells of dizziness. He had to wear glasses for reading. The last letter he had sent Mrs. Gilchrist was from Brooklyn, where he spent 2 months in the spring of 1872, trying to shake off, without the assistance of doctors, whom his long immunity had caused him to distrust, the recurring spells which told him that all was not well within. Again, in the middle of that summer, he went home to rest. The final blow came in January. Some years later, he told a friend how it had happened. On the night of the 22nd of February, 1873, I was in the Treasury Building in Washington. Outside it was raining, sleeting, and quite cold and dark. The office was comfortable, and I had a good fire. I was lazily reading Bulwer's What Will He Do With It, but I did not feel well, and put aside the book several times. I remained at the office until pretty late. My lodging room was about 100 yards down the street. At last I got up to go home. At the door of the Treasury, one of the friendly group of guards asked me what ailed me, and said I looked quite ill. He proposed to let a man take his place while he would convey me home. I said, "No, I can go well enough." He again said he would go with me, but I again declined. Then he went down the steps and stood at the door with his lantern until I reached the house where I lived. I walked up to my room and went to bed and to sleep. Woke up about 3 or 4 o'clock and found that I could not move my left arm or leg. Did not feel particularly uneasy about it. Was in no pain, and even did not seem to be very ill. Thought it would pass off. Went to sleep again and slept till daylight. Then, however, I found that I could not get up, could not move. After several hours some friends came in, and they immediately sent for a doctor, fortunately a very good one, Dr. W.B. Drinkard. He looked very grave, thought my condition markedly serious. I did not think so. I supposed the attack would pass off soon, but it did not. 3 months before, Whitman's mother, now approaching 80, had failed in health and had been taken to Camden, New Jersey, to spend her few remaining days with George, who was engaged in business there. Whitman knew that he must conceal from his mother the serious nature of his illness, lest he aggravate her own. The same tenderness which had enforced his silence towards Mrs. Gilchrist expressed itself in a forced cheerfulness in the letters he wrote every day or two from his sick bed to his mother. "Dearest mother, I wrote you Sunday, enclosing the $20, which I suppose you received all safe. I'm still anchored here in my bed. I'm sitting up now on the side. Mrs. O'Connor has just been to see me. I was glad to see her. I'm still improving, but slowly. The doctor did not come yesterday, which I suppose is a good sign. I expect him this afternoon or evening. He evidently thinks I am on the gain. Pete has just come in, and will take this to the post office for me. Love to you, dear mother, and to all." But fate, having dealt largely with Whitman, seemed now determined to break him body and spirit. Jeff's wife, Martha, to whom Walt was devoted, was dying of consumption in St. Louis. The end came but a few weeks after his stroke. His reason told him, and he comforted his mother, that she was better off, but his heart would be appeased no more easily than Mrs. Gilchrist's. Poor Martha, the thoughts of her still come up in my mind as I sit here a great deal of the time alone. Poor Jeff, and poor children too. But as the early spring of the South began to make glad the earth with bird and leaf, Whitman gradually grew able to shuffle along to a street car for a ride, or to the office to read and write letters, though he could not take up his regular tasks. His mother, however, rapidly failed till Walt grew alarmed. Dear Mother, I feel very anxious about you. It is very distressing to have the nervous system affected. It always makes one feel so discouraged that it is the worst of it. Mother, I am afraid you are more unwell than you say. I think about it night and day. The enclosed letter came to me yesterday. Jeff sent it to me by mistake. Maybe for me has gone to you. I got another letter from Jeff. All are well. Jeff, too, is anxious about you. Mother, try to write a line soon after you get this. I'm writing this in the office. Mother, I shall come on. A few days later, the last of May, he hastened by train to her bedside. He looked for the last time into eyes which had found more deep and abiding affection in his own than ever had any one else. When she died, he had less to live for. 2 years later, preparing for publication a collection of his miscellaneous prose writings, the thought of her was more real to him than his new book. I occupy myself arranging these pages for publication, still enveloped in thoughts of the death 2 years since of my dear mother, the most perfect and magnetic character, the rarest combination of practical, moral, and spiritual, and the least selfish of all and any I have ever known, and by me, oh, so much the most deeply loved. Her death was necessary for Whitman fully to realize how great had been Mrs. Whitman's influence on him in the many letters he wrote to her during his wartime ministrations, describing each wounded boy as though they had a common motherly interest in him. It is easy to see that Whitman and his mother were comrades. He approximated her own kindness and comprehension, her own unselfish bestowal of herself on others. But when she died, he realized what she had been to him in the days when his own emotional life had been less self-contained, his self-reliance less sure. His early egotism was a subconscious protection against a sense of inferiority. At that time, though sympathizing with him without comprehension, she had been essential to his happiness and his peace. The contrast which her Dutch wholesomeness presented to the rather ineffectual, if not morbid, spirit of her husband, if one may judge from their records and portraits, must have given her added influence in shaping the ideals of Walt. And if he found in his physical makeup not only her physique, but a certain softness, a certain intuitiveness, a certain passive content with the senses that was in her, it is not strange that he should have loved her by far the most, and this attachment was the more powerful for not being a thing of the mind. He has repeatedly referred to her as a perfect mother, but there is little evidence other than his testimony that she was a remarkable woman. For instance, she was unable to spell or punctuate the simplest letter, unable to discuss books or art in any way. This was a decided disadvantage for the young self-made poet. But does he deplore it? Not at all. He glorifies in it, and thinks of her as one of the powerful, uneducated persons who were to be the backbone of his ideal democracy. So close was the emotional connection between them that he is content to describe her in general terms that mean so much to him, but little to the reader. We have to thank Mrs. Whitman for much that is characteristic in her son, much that is noble, but for much also that is unpolished and inarticulate. Franklin's father, though an uneducated middle-class candlemaker, was able to guide his son by sheer common sense and knowledge of the world toward the career which so adequately expressed his talents. But Mrs. Whitman, in somewhat the same situation, could but encourage her son to follow whatever inward light was in him. Had she been a woman of information and intelligence, we might have had something not only more perfect in Leaves of Grass, but something more perfectly suited to the needs of America. Nevertheless, in his purely personal relationship to his mother, Whitman from the first to last displayed a filial devotion which is more beautiful than any book he could have written, and we are content to let the man take precedence over his art. The sun is yet a long journey to the horizon, but unmistakably it is now descending. The great hours of Whitman's labor and love have come and gone. No more will the weak and wounded lean upon his body for strength. The time has come for him to be old at 54, nor from that wounded brain will his fancy again set sail for the daring passage to India. He may now read with understanding a poem by his first master written a few years before. It is time to be old, to take in sail. The god of bounds, who sets to seas ashore, came to me in his fatal rounds, and said no more, no farther shoot thy broad ambitious branches and thy root. Fancy departs, no more invent, contract thy firmament to compass of a tent. End of section 13. Section 14 of Whitman, An Interpretation in Narrative by Emory Holloway. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 7, Part 1, The Long Afternoon. Like other original poetic geniuses, Whitman had achieved his best effects by expressing through the talents of maturity the spirit of youth. But to the modern mind, such a genius is limited in its influence by reason of its apparent uniqueness. We are disposed to demand that a leader show himself of like passions with other men, tempted by like trials and confronted by like problems. Whitman's comparative freedom from responsibility and his truly marvelous health, while they seemed adequate cause for his optimism and buoyant courage, detracted somewhat from his influence as an exemplar. But now, like Job, he is to be subjected to what was for him the greatest of trials, the loss of his position in the Attorney General's Department, which occurred when, after 18 months of illness, there was no indication of his recovery, was not taken much to heart. Beyond the independence of a little sum laid aside for burial money, and of a few clapboards around and shingles overhead on a lot of American soil owned, and the easy dollars that supply the year's plain clothing and meals, he had declared in beginning his poetic mission, the great poet need have no financial care. And this much for the time at least he had, but a greater trial would be in his illness, not the unaccustomed pain, though the power to suffer gracefully is hard to acquire in age, but the limitation such illness would place on his mixing with the people who most inspired him, and on basking in the smile of nature, quite as essential to his spirit as food was to his body. The illness would go deeper even than that, for it would cause lassitude, distress in the brain, all but robbing him of his creative power. Perhaps now he would never be able to complete his poetic design, or even to bring together his fugitive writings so as clearly to indicate it. To detail the events of 19 years of this invalidism would be as unnecessary as it were tedious, yet we cannot complete our picture of Whitman without showing how he stood this trial. For 11 years Whitman was forced to make his home with George in Camden. He was not looked upon as a dependent, and he was treated with fraternal kindness. George's wife, an excellent woman, was as considerate of his welfare as his own sisters could have been. Nevertheless, it was necessity rather than choice which stranded the old rover in such quiet and unfrequented waters. Making for the sea-coast on his doctor's orders, he had found himself too weak to get there. Whitman was, of course, in no position to say so, but in George he saw that American bourgeoisie against which, despite his championship of the average man, his poetry was aimed, and despite his glorification of the heroic qualities which that average man had displayed in the war, none more than George Whitman. But men like George were unable to pioneer for a better world, unable even to protect the liberty already gained, since to their unimaginative minds liberty meant little more than comfortable convention. George believes in pipes, not in poems, he said, adding that none of his immediate family ever knew what he was really up to in his poetry. Very different from this from the conversations with Burroughs and O'Connor and his newspaper friends in Washington, and sadly different his present room, that in which his mother had died, from the exhilarating walks along the Potomac in the mystical moonlight. But dragging his paralyzed left leg along with his cane, and followed by his dog, apparently the first pet he has ever had or needed, he would make his way to the streetcar. It was a shabby substitute for the Broadway stages, or even for the Washington cars, where he had been saluted daily by persons of importance. But he had not lost his faculty for making friends, and soon he had installed himself as a patron deity on the driver's platform, or he would ply back and forth on the ferries to Philadelphia. He would sometimes kill an afternoon hour in the Mercantile Library, and he gradually found his way to the printing offices. There, as he grew stronger, he would set up the rare poems he composed, or the more numerous prose pieces reminiscent of the last thrilling years of his life, and send them off to be printed in the Graphic or elsewhere. A few months after the death of his mother, George moved into a more spacious house that he had built on Stephen Street, for George was prospering in business and had the ideas of the man who prospers. Here Whitman installed himself on the top floor, where was plenty of sunshine, but he was lonely, and to ease his loneliness he wrote letters to Pete Doyle. For a time he was able to believe that his malady would pass. Nothing in his life had as yet taught him that disease could conquer the constitution which he believed invulnerable. He was prejudiced against medicine, but it is doubtful whether medicine could have cured him. At length he seems to have given up hope. The prose sketches of Washington were without traces of despondency, were as vivid and as suggestive as ever, yet he felt it time to sing a song of farewell ere his muse, his fancy, should depart. For the very reason that he had chosen to think little about his income, he was the more depressed when it stopped altogether. He might write Doyle week after week that he would yet resume their free comradeship together, but the dismissal from his clerkship was a stubborn fact, and at the same time his agents in New York began to swindle him of his small profits on the sale of his books. In the summer of 1872 he was invited to recite a commencement poem at Tufts College in Massachusetts. For this occasion he wrote the Song of the Universal, though he was unable to make the journey to Massachusetts to read the poem in person. By common consent he wrote a few years later, "There is nothing better for man or woman than a perfect and noble life, morally without flaw, happily balanced in activity, physically sound and pure, giving its due proportion, and no more, to the sympathetic, the human, emotional element. A life in these unhasting, unresting, untiring, to the end." And yet there is another shape of personality dearer far to the artist's sense, which likes the play of strongest lights and shades, where the perfect character, the good, the heroic, although never attained, is never lost sight of, but through failures, sorrows, temporary downfalls, is returned to again and again, and while often violated, is passionately adhered to as long as mind, muscle, voice obey the power we call volition. This sort of personality we see more or less in Burns, Byron, Schiller, and George Sand. And of course he meant in Walt Whitman, and the America of which he was the rightful poet. So he would sing in simple lyric lines the song of faith, of amelioration. 1. "Come," said the Muse, "sing me a song no poet yet has chanted. Sing me the universal. In this broad earth of ours, amid the measureless grossness and the slag, enclosed, and safe within its central heart, nestles the seed perfection. By every life a share, or more or less, none born but it is born, concealed or unconcealed the seed is waiting." 2. Lo, keen-eyed towering science, as from tall peaks the modern overlooking, successive, absolute fiats issuing. Yet again, lo, the soul above all science, for it has history gathered like a husk around the globe, for it the entire star myriads roll through the sky, in spiral routes by long detours, as a much-tacking ship upon the sea. For it the partial to the permanent flowing, for it the real to the ideal tends, for it the mystic evolution, not the right only justified, what we call evil also justified. Forth from their masks, no matter what, from the huge festering trunk, from craft and guile and tears, health to emerge, and joy, joy universal. Out of the bulk, the morbid and the shallow, out of the bad majority, the varied countless frauds of men and states, electric, antiseptic, yet cleaving, suffusing all, only the good is universal. 3. Over the mountain growths, disease and sorrow, an uncaught bird is ever hovering, hovering high in the purer, happier air. From imperfection's murkiest cloud darts always forth one ray of perfect light, one flash of heaven's glory. To fashion's customs discord, to the mad babbled din, the deafening orgies, soothing each lull, a strain is heard, just heard, from some far shore, the final chorus sounding. For, oh, the blessed eyes, the happy hearts that see, that know the guiding thread so fine along the mighty labyrinth. 5. And thou, America, for the scheme's culmination, its thought and its reality, for these, not for thyself, thou hast arrived, thou too surroundest all, embracing, carrying, welcoming all, thou too by pathways broad and new to the ideal tendest. The measured faiths of other lands, the grandeurs of the past, are not for thee, but grandeurs of thine own, deific face and amplitudes, absorbing, comprehending all eligible to all for immortality, love like the light, silently wrapping all, nature's amelioration, blessing all, the blossoms, fruits of ages, orchards, divine and certain, forms, objects, growths, humanities, to spiritual images ripening. 6. Give me, O God, to sing that thought. Give me, o'er her I love, this quenchless faith in thy ensemble. Whatever else withheld, withhold not from us. Belief in plan of thee, enclosed in time and space, health, peace, salvation universal. Is it a dream? Nay, but the lack of it the dream, and failing it, life's lore and wealth a dream, and all the world a dream. About this time he wrote for Harper's The Song of the Redwood Tree, making still more personal his valedictory. Farewell, my brethren, farewell, O earth and sky, farewell, ye neighboring waters, my time has ended, my term has come. With appropriate symbolism, the mighty poet, about to fall and leave a lonesome place against the sky, identifies himself with the mighty tree, its death chanting, and shares a dignity with the woods and waves. Nor yield we mournfully, majestic brothers, we who have grandly filled our time. With nature's calm content, with tacit huge delight, we welcome what we fought for through the past, and leave the field for them predicted long, for a superber race. They too grandly fill their time. For them we abdicate, in them ourselves, ye forest kings. And then retiring to his closet, he addresses his last great song to his God. Again, symbolism, modest and sincere. It is the prayer of Columbus he sings, and has a right to sing. The theme had engaged the attention of American writers from the first, who with Columbiads, sonnets on Columbus, narratives of his voyages, and what not, had thought to pay him a compliment from the world he had discovered. But the bow of Ulysses will bend only in the hands of Ulysses. Poets and professional writers, borrowing the very verse forms they employed, and discovering no new world for themselves, could not hope to do justice to a theme so sublime. But with the unconscious assurance of great power, Whitman sings the song of Columbus and of all great pioneers. When Anne Gilchrist received a copy of the poem, she wrote him a hasty note, the more eloquent for its brevity. March 9th, 1874. With full heart, with eyes wet with tears of joy, and I know not what other deep emotion, pain of yearning, pity blent with sense of grandeur, dearest friend, have I read and reread the great sacred poem just come to me. O august Columbus, whose sorrows, sufferings, struggles are more to be envied than any triumph of conquering warrior, as I see him in your poem, his figure merges into yours, brother of Columbus, completer of his work, discoverer of the spiritual, the ideal America. You too have sailed over stormy seas to your goal, surrounded with mocking disbelievers. You too have paid the price of health, our Columbus. Your accents pierce me through and through, your loving Annie. A battered, wrecked old man, thrown on his savage shore, far, far from home, pent by the sea in dark, rebellious brows, 12 dreary months, sore, stiff with many toils, sickened and nigh to death, I take my way along the island's edge, venting a heavy heart. I'm too full of woe. Haply I may not live another day. I cannot rest, O God, I cannot eat or drink or sleep, till I put forth myself, my prayer once more to thee, breathe, bathe myself once more in thee, commune with thee, report myself once more to thee. All my emprises have been filled with thee, my speculations, plans, begun and carried on in thought of thee. Sailing the deep or journeying the land for thee, intentions, purports, aspirations, mind leaving results to thee. Oh, I am sure they really came from thee, the urge, the ardor, the unconquerable will, the potent felt interior command, stronger than words, a message from the heavens, whispering to me even in sleep. These sped me on. One effort more, my altar, this bleak sand, that thou, O God, my life hast lighted with ray of light, steady, ineffable, vouchsafed of thee, light, rare, untellable, lighting the very light, beyond all signs, descriptions, languages. For that, O God, be it my latest word, here on my knees, old, poor, and paralyzed, I thank thee. My hands, my limbs grow nerveless, my brain reels racked, bewildered. Let the old timbers part, I will not part. I will cling fast to thee, O God, though the waves buffet me, thee at least I know. Were this the story of a demigod, as some have told it, and not that of a very human man, the end should come at this point. It invites apotheosis. But with the passing of this gloomy year and the next, passed also the worst of his present illness. He wrote little to Mrs. Gilchrist, though she continued to write. With characteristic assurance that her affection was returned in kind, she seemed to have taken his present of a ring as a sort of betrothal, and writes now as an intimate. Were she not kept in England by the necessity of caring for her own invalid mother and her children, she would have come to America at once on hearing of Walt's illness, that she might care for him. Besides, she hoped that her children might grow up in the America which she had idealized from his poetic descriptions. But if he did not write, he did send her newspapers and magazines. On these she begged him to underscore the word London in the address whenever he was improving in health, so hungry was her heart for grounds of hope. He seldom did. And when conversing with Moncure Conway in December 1875, she learned from the latter, who had recently visited Whitman, that the poet had given up all hope of recovery. She did her best to nurse his discouraged spirit, unwilling to be cheated, even by death himself, of that brief human happiness she had for 6 years thought hers by right. Those words of Mr. Conway were like a sharp knife plunged into me. They choked me with bitter tears. Don't give up that hope for the sake of those that so tenderly, passionately love you, would give their lives with joy for you. Oh, cling to life with a resolute hold, my beloved, to bless us with your presence. Unspeakably dear, beneficent presence, me to taste of it before so very long now, thirsting, pining, loving me. Just how much Whitman may have been stimulated by this appeal to his hope and his pity, we do not know, but a few months later he had taken a new lease on life, his malady yielding in a measure to a different regimen. By the middle of 1876 Whitman was able to betake himself to White Horse, a hamlet 10 or 12 miles from Camden, toward the sea. Here he boarded with a farmer named Stafford at various times during the ensuing summers. The family was fond of Whitman, and while they did not understand his poetry, seemed to understand the man and his needs. By day or night the broken poet was allowed to consort with nature as he would. Not far from the house ran Timber Creek, protected by woodland, where Whitman varied his sun baths with baths in the mud of a moral pit. Far from cruel eyes, the din of contending critics, the noisy activity of the city, he here lay down in confidence on the breast of nature, and she crooned and soothed him back to partial health. And as if determined to wrest some poetic advantage even from his convalescence, Whitman became sensitive as never before to the intimate, friendly spirit of a nature which had always been to him a trifle august. His habit of recording his impressions again asserts itself. Let us take from his cheerful diary a few specimen days. After you have exhausted what there is in business, politics, conviviality, love, and so on, have found that none of these finally satisfy or permanently wear, what remains? Nature remains, to bring out from their torpid recesses the affinities of a man or woman with the open air, the trees, fields, the changes of seasons, the sun by day, and the stars of heaven by night. We will begin from these convictions. Literature flies so high and is so hotly spiced that our notes may seem hardly more than breaths of common air or draughts of water to drink, but that is part of our lesson. Dear, soothing, healthy restoration hours, after 3 confining years of paralysis, after the long strain of the war and its wounds and death, away then to loosen, to unstring the divine bow, so tense, so long, away from curtain, carpet, sofa, book, from society, from city, house, street, and modern improvements and luxuries, away to the primitive winding, aforementioned wooded creek, with its untrimmed bushes and turfy banks, away from ligatures, tight boots, buttons, and the whole cast-iron civilized life, from entourage of artificial store, machine, studio, office, parlor, from tailordom and fashion's clothes, from any clothes perhaps for the nonce, the summer heats advancing, there in those watery shaded solitudes. Away, thou soul, let me pick thee out singly, reader dear, and talk in perfect freedom, negligently, confidentially, for one day and night at least, returning to the naked source life of us all, to the breast of the great silent savage, all-acceptive mother. Alas, how many of us are so sodden, how many of us have wandered so far away, that return is almost impossible. He sits up through the night, listening to the flight of migrating birds, not like Audubon to estimate their number, but to pick out the familiar voices of his unseen friends. By day he strolls down to his tryst at the creek, drinking his health and joy through every sense and pore, as in his youth. The wild cherry and pear blows, the wild violets, their blue eyes looking up and saluting my feet as I saunter the wood edge, the rosy blush of budding apple trees, the light clear emerald hue of the wheat fields, the darker green of the rye, a warm elasticity pervading the air, the cedar bushes profusely decked with their little brown apples, the summer fully awakening, the convocation of blackbirds, garrulous flocks of them, gathering on some tree and making the hour and place noisy as I sit near. Nature marches in procession, in sections like the corps of an army. All have done much for me, and still do, but for the last 2 days it has been the great wild bee, the humble bee, or Bumble, as the children call him. As I walk or hobble from the farmhouse down to the creek, I traverse the before-mentioned lane, fenced by old rails with many splits, splinters, breaks, holes, etc., the choice habitat of those crooning hairy insects. Up and down and by and between these rails they swarm and dart and fly in countless myriads. As I wend slowly along, I am often accompanied with a roving cloud of them. They play a leading part in my morning, midday, or sunset rambles, and often dominate the landscape in a way I never before thought of, fill the long lane, not by scores or hundreds only, but by thousands. Large and vivacious and swift, with wonderful momentum and a loud swelling perpetual hum, varied now and then by something almost like a shriek, they dart to and fro in rapid flashes, chasing each other, and little things as they are, conveying to me a new and pronounced sense of strength, beauty, vitality, and movement. As I write, I am seated under a big wild cherry tree, the warm day tempered by partial clouds and a fresh breeze, neither too heavy nor light, and here I sit long and long, enveloped in the deep musical drone of these bees, flitting, balancing, darting to and fro about me by hundreds, big fellows with light yellow jackets, great glistening, swelling bodies, stumpy heads, and gauzy wings, humming their perpetual rich mellow boom. Is there not a hint in it for a musical composition of which it should be the background, some bumblebee symphony? That peculiarly American insect, hot midsummer's petted crone, which so pleased Emerson with its Epicurean philosophy, seems not only in a passage like this, written with Thoreau's accuracy and far more than Thoreau's sympathy, but also in much of his early poetry, to create the background of his own musical composition. Now an evening piece. And still the clear notes of the quail, the quiver of leaf shadows over the paper as I write, the sky aloft with white clouds and the sun well declining to the west, the swift darting of many sand swallows coming and going, their holes in a neighboring marl bank, the odor of the cedar and oak so palpable as evening approaches, perfume, color, the bronze and gold of nearly ripened wheat, clover fields with honey scent, the well-up maize with long and rustling leaves, the great patches of the thriving potatoes, dusky green, flecked all over with white blossoms, the old warty venerable oak above me, and ever mixed with the dual notes of the quail, the soughing of the wind through some nearby pines. As I rise for return, I linger long to a delicious song epilogue. Is it the hermit thrush from some bushy recess off there in the swamp, repeatedly, leisurely, and pensively over and over again? This to the circle gambols of the swallows flying by dozens in concentric rings in the last rays of sunset like flashes of some airy wheel. Or take something more mystical, more pantheistic. But now, pleasantly imprisoned here under the big oak, the rain dripping and the sky covered with leaden clouds, nothing but the pond on one side and the other a spread of grass spotted with the milky blossoms of the wild carrot, the sound of an axe wielded at some distant woodpile, yet in this dull scene, as most folks would call it, why am I so almost happy here and alone? Why would any intrusion, even from people I like, spoil the charm? But am I alone? Doubtless there comes a time, perhaps it has come to me, when one feels through his whole being, and pronouncedly the emotional part, that identity between himself subjectively and nature objectively, which Schelling and Fichte are so fond of pressing. How it is I know not, but I often realize a presence here. In clear moods I am certain of it, and neither chemistry nor reasoning nor aesthetics will give the least explanation. All the past 2 summers it has been strengthening and nourishing my sick body and soul as never before. Thanks, invisible physician, for thy silent, delicious medicine, thy day and night, thy water and thy airs, the banks, the grass, the trees, and e'en the weeds. That was a mood which Wordsworth could have understood, or the Greek poets. To get it would be worth having been suckled in a creed outworn. Only Whitman found it perfectly consonant with the most modern creeds. I had a sort of dream trance the other day in which I saw my favorite trees step out and promenade up and down and around very curiously. With a whisper from one, leaning down as he passed me, "We do all this on the present occasion exceptionally just for you." Few poets go farther in recalling to us the vanishing perceptions of childhood. These leaves, torn from specimen days, not only indicate the method of Whitman's restoration and the source of his sweetness of spirit, but they reveal, too, how much his prose has improved by contact with his increasingly meticulous verse. A final passage will record his reaction to the more majestic aspects of nature, and show how, like a musician rather than a painter, he transferred the mood of the sea to his written page. One bright December midday lately I spent down on the New Jersey seashore, reaching it by a little more than an hour's railroad trip over the old Camden and Atlantic. I'd started betimes, fortified by nice strong coffee and a good breakfast cooked by the hands I love, my dear sister Lou's. How much better it makes the victuals taste, and then assimilate strength in you, perhaps makes the whole day comfortable afterwards. 5 or 6 miles at the last, or our trek entered a broad region of salt grass meadows, intersected by lagoons and cut up everywhere by watering runs. The sedgy perfume, delightful to my nostrils, reminded me of the mashed and south bay of my native island. I could have journeyed contentedly till night through these flat and odorous sea prairies. After dinner, as there were nearly 2 hours to spare, I walked off in another direction, hardly met or saw a person, and taking possession of what appeared to have been the reception-room of an old bath-house range, had a broad expanse of view all to myself, quaint, refreshing, unimpeded, a dry area of sedge and Indian grass immediately before and around me, space, simple, unornamented space. Distant vessels and the far-off, just visible, trailing smoke of an inward-bound steamer, more plainly ships, brigs, schooners in sight, most of them with every sail set to the firm and steady wind. The attractions, fascinations there are in sea and shore. How one dwells on their simplicity, even vacuity. What is it in us aroused by those indirections and directions? That spread of waves and grey-white beach, salt, monotonous, senseless. Such an entire absence of art, books, talk, elegance, so indescribably comforting. Even this winter day, grim, yet so delicate-looking, so spiritual, striking emotional, impalpable depths, subtler than all the poems, paintings, music I've ever read, seen, heard. Yet let me be fair, perhaps it is because I've read those poems and heard that music. Even as a boy I had the fancy, the wish to write a piece, perhaps a poem, about the sea-shore, that suggesting dividing line, contact junction, the solid marrying the liquid, that curious lurking something, as doubtless every objective form finally becomes to the subjective spirit, which means far more than its mere first sight, grand as that is, blending the real and ideal, and each made portion of the other. Hours, days, in my Long Island youth and early manhood, I haunted the shores of Rockaway or Coney Island, or away east to the Hamptons or Montauk. Once at the latter place by the old lighthouse, nothing but sea tossings in sight in every direction as far as the eye could reach. I remember well, I felt that I must one day write a book expressing this liquid mystic theme. Afterward I recollect how it came to me that, instead of any lyrical or epical or literary attempt, the seashore should be an invisible influence, a pervading gauge and tally for me in my composition. Let me give a hint here to young writers. I'm not sure, but I have unwittingly followed out the same rule with other powers besides sea and shores, avoiding them in the way of any dead set at poetizing them as too big for formal handling, quite satisfied if I could indirectly show that we have met and fused, even if only once, but enough, that we have really absorbed each other and understand each other. The year 1876 being celebrated, especially at Philadelphia, as the centennial of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, from which Whitman had, in his third edition, affected to date all things American, Sidney Lanier was to write his Psalm of the West as a cantata for the opening of the exposition. Whitman felt that he himself was the man who should have done that, if only he had been in his prime, but at least he would bring out a new and handsome edition. It would be a birthday gift to his country, and might bring in some sorely needed revenue. It was to be in 2 volumes, this author's edition in half leather, with photographs of the poet and his autograph in each set. The first volume, a reprint of the 1871 edition, which had not sold, was called Leaves of Grass. The other volume, 2 rivulas, contained both prose and poetry, incorporating democratic vistas as a strong bird on pinions free, and Passage to India, and publishing for the first time in collected form the memoranda during the war, which he had projected in 1863, a group of centennial songs, in which the American Institute poem was rededicated to the Philadelphia Exposition, and other fugitive prose and poetry written since his last volume. The title was meant to suggest not so much the blending of prose and verse as 2 themes. First, speculations on political and literary conditions in America, and second, a realistic and imaginative treatment of death and immortality. It was not a symmetrical book, but at least it brought together, as best the author could in his illness, the writings which he thought would endure. Somewhat to his surprise, the book sold fairly well in America, much more rapidly in England. This foreign success was due partly to the active solicitation of Rossetti and Mrs. Gilchrist, partly to an international squabble concerning the new edition, and especially concerning the alleged neglect of Whitman by American publishers and critics. We have seen that from the first Whitman found it hard to bear with equanimity his lack of popularity in America. This is sufficiently revealed in his willingness to write or to influence reviews of his work. But the impatience of his friends was greater than his own, and now that he was marooned in Camden and in need of cash, it was natural, though hardly heroic, for him to let this feeling grow. He was naive enough not to trace it logically to his physical and financial debacle. In January 1876 appeared an article in the West Jersey Press, which the student of Whitman will recognize as inspired, if not actually written by him. It complained of the neglect of his books. They had been met and are met today with the determined denial, disgust, and scorn of orthodox American authors, publishers, and editors, and in a pecuniary and worldly sense have certainly wrecked the life of their author. But the poet himself is more resolute and persevering than ever. The article was quoted in the London Athenaeum, and provoked Robert Buchanan in the London Daily News to excoriate Americans on this neglect. Such was the beginning of a wrangle which occupied the British and American press for some weeks. Bayard Taylor and George William Curtis protested that Whitman had the same opportunity that other writers had in getting his work published, and that his neglect had been shared by many of our great authors. It was possible for him to have no regular publisher. they said, or to have poems returned by editors without the necessity of assuming that any conspiracy existed to suppress him. Burroughs went to the defense of Buchanan and Whitman, and even Alfred Austin, who saw little in Whitman's verse form but highly respected the man for his war service, wrote to the press in his favor. All of this was publicity, though certainly not of a sort that Whitman could have calculated on or desired. The real returns came more privately. Rossetti wrote to Whitman to get the facts, and asking how his British friends might aid him. In part, this was Whitman's reply. I'm jogging along still about the same in physical condition, still certainly no worse, and I sometimes lately suspect rather better, or at any rate more adjusted to the situation. Even begin to think of making some move, some change of base, etc. The doctors have been advising it for over 2 years, but I haven't felt to do it yet. My paralysis does not lift. I cannot walk any distance. I still have this baffling, obstinate, apparently chronic affection of the stomachic apparatus and liver. Yet I get out of doors a little every day, write and read in moderation, appetite sufficiently good, eat only plain food, but always did that, digest intolerable, spirits unflagging. My dear friend, your offers of help and those of my other British friends I think I fully appreciate in the right spirit, welcome and accepted, leaving the matter altogether in your and their hands, and to your and their convenience, discretion, leisure, and nicety. Though poor now, even to penury, I have not so far been deprived of any physical thing I need or wish whatever, and I feel confident I shall not in the future. During my employment of 7 years or more in Washington after the war, 1865 to 72, I regularly saved part of my wages, and though the sum has now become about exhausted by my expenses of the last 3 years, there are already beginning at present welcome dribbles hitherto from the sales of my new edition, which I job and sell myself. All through this illness my book agents for 3 years in New York successfully badly cheated me, and shall continue to dispose of my books myself. And that is the way I should prefer to glean my support. In that way I cheerfully accept all the aid my friends find it convenient to proffer. Rossetti and Mrs. Gilchrist bestirred themselves to get subscribers once they had Whitman's permission to do so. The response was immediate, and cheered Whitman in his hour of gloom, not only with the inflow of money enough to serve him for some years, but with the proof that he had made a strong impression in England. Among those who subscribed, some sending 2 or 3 times the high price asked for the books, were the Rossettis, Mrs. Gilchrist, Lord Houghton, Edward Dowden, Edward Carpenter, Tennyson, Ruskin, Ghost, T.W. Rolleston, George Sansbury, Moncure, Conway, J.H. McCarthy, Maddox Brown, G.H. Lewes, and E.J.A. Balfour. But while Mrs. Gilchrist was giving this testimony of her loyalty and her desire to be of real service, her mind was chiefly engrossed with the plan to come to America, where she seems to have counted on finding a lover, if not a husband, aged and broken in health to be sure, but yet a fulfillment of her now familiar dream. This Whitman did not desire, either on her account or on his. He must have disliked being forced into a position from which he could not retreat. He must now have regretted his efforts to be kind, to break to her gently the fact that his heart was not at her disposal, perhaps not at his own. In the very letter in which he advised her of having sent her a set of the centennial edition, he insisted in italics, "My dearest friend, I do not approve your American trans-settlement. I see so many things here you have no idea of, the social and almost every other kind of crudeness, meagreness here, at least in appearance. Don't do anything towards it, nor resolve in it, nor make any move at all in it, without further advice from me. If I should get well enough to voyage, we will talk about it yet in London." Anything at all to stop her, even the polite fiction about his going to London, anything that is short of wounding her with the plain fact that she could not expect to find in him what her imagination had put there. But it would not work. What was crudeness to one who was in love? And what even his express command when she was in love, not with him, but with her dream? Her mother had died the year before, and her eldest son Percy was shortly to have a home of his own. Beatrice, her other daughter, could complete her medical education in Philadelphia, which she could not do in London, and the trip would be good for her young artist son Herbert. And so, packing up her household goods as if she meant to spend the rest of her days in America, she took ship and arrived in Philadelphia in September 1876. The story of their meeting would be illuminating, but neither Whitman nor Mrs. Gilchrist has left any record of it. He being the man he was, and she being a woman, this meeting must have defined and clarified their relationship better than letters or even spoken words could ever do. Did Whitman cross to Philadelphia to meet the ship on which he had sailed, or did she have to pay the first visit like a pilgrim instead of receiving it like a lover courted? We do not know, but may be permitted to guess he chose the latter alternative. Whitman, if not uneasy about the meeting, was at least a little on the defensive. He preferred to let the whole journey seem a pilgrimage. That party could act without risk to his independence, and with the least possible danger of wounding a woman who had cast such a tribute at his feet. Were this the story of Anne Gilchrist, imagination would insist on picturing the hopes and fears that must have warred for the mastery in her breast as she approached the hour of which for 7 years she had dreamed, the hour which would either give to airy nothings a local habitation, or else show them to be what they were. But ours is the story of the invalid poet pursued, fortunately for him, the very ambiguity in his book, which precipitated this anomalous situation, made it possible for him to extricate himself. He had but to continue to act the part of a poet, and after a few painful moments all would be well, provided only she should not have the power of fascinating him as she had hypnotized herself. Even there Whitman was fortified. He had learned the limitations of personal fascination, and he had known enough beautiful women to be able to see at once that Mrs. Gilchrist's charm was more of the mind and soul than of the face or figure. She herself seemed to realize this and to put her best foot foremost. Nevertheless, there was something sublime in her foolish courage. And it is necessary for the reader to know only that the bearing of both parties in this unrecorded meeting was such as to substitute a lofty yet intimate friendship for a romance which fate had not decreed. During the residence of the Gilchrists in Philadelphia, Whitman was a regular, a constant visitor, sometimes occupying for weeks the room set apart for him in their house on 22nd Street. Once at least Whitman took all the Gilchrists to the theater to see Joaquin Miller's new play, The Daynights. Under the careful tutoring of Anne Gilchrist, and by reason of his own benignant charm, Whitman was accepted by the son and daughter as cordially as by the mother. Grace, he declared to a friend, was his favorite in the household. Other guests were invited, and the Gilchrist home took on something of the character of a modest salon. Lofty discussions of literature, of science, or history and art were, for persons as old as Mrs. Gilchrist and Whitman, appropriate substitutes for the scenes of endearment on which he had dwelt in fond anticipation. It is to Whitman's credit that in a situation like this he could have inspired the lady to feel, not the fury of a woman's scorn, but such admiration as she expressed soon after her first meeting with Whitman in a letter she wrote to William Rossetti. I need not tell you that our greatest pleasure is the society of Mr. Whitman, who fully realizes the ideal I had formed from his poems, and brings such an atmosphere of cordiality and geniality with him as is indescribable. He is really making slow but, I trust, steady progress toward recovery, having been much cheered, and no doubt that acted favorably upon his health, by the sympathy manifested toward him in England, and the pleasure of finding so many buyers of his poems there. Mrs. Gilchrist remained in Philadelphia more than a year before going to Boston, Concord, and New York to meet the literary society which dominated as yet American letters. After knowing Whitman in person for a year, she wrote Rossetti, "We are having delightful evenings this winter. How often do I wish you could make one in the circle around our tea table where sits on my right hand every evening but Sunday Walt Whitman. He has made great progress in health and recovered powers of getting about during the year we have been here. Nevertheless, the lameness, the dragging instead of lifting the left leg continues, and this, together with his white hair and beard, give him a look of age curiously contradicted by his face, which has not only the ruddy freshness, but the full rounded contours of youth, nowhere drawn or wrinkled or sunk. It is a face as indicative of serenity and goodness, and of mental and bodily health, as the brow is of intellectual power. But I notice he occasionally speaks of himself as having a wounded brain, and of being still quite altered from his former self. At 40 he had described himself as a child very old, and now at 56 he might even the score, by affirming that he was an old man yet very young. That Whitman was really improving in health is indicated by his ability to travel. John Burroughs, who had since Whitman knew him in Washington built a home at Aesopus on the Hudson, met Whitman at Mrs. Gilchrist one day in February and accompanied him to New York. There he was, the guest of Mr. J. H. Johnston and his wife, Alma Calder Johnston, both of whom loved him as a man and adored him as a poet. To spend a month in such a home was as beneficial to him as the Timber Creek loafing had been. He moved slowly along Broadway, taking the salutes of such stage drivers as remembered him, and occasionally climbing to the box for a ride. He renewed his acquaintance with the ferry pilots and deckhands. He visited the many spots dear to him by association in the days of his vigorous youth. He even submitted to a degree of lionizing, showing himself at the receptions which Johnston's held in his honor, and attending formal soirées at the Portfolio and Palette clubs. He was invited to join the Authors' Club, and though declining, was grateful for the honor. The Whitman, who was so uncomfortable in evening clothes in New Orleans, could now enjoy the poet's privilege, as he understood it, of dressing in strong contrast to the elite of New York society, wearing his loose sack suit of English gray, his spotless white shirt collar open at the neck with no necktie. A little later in the year it began to be clear that Mrs. Gilchrist was but the first of a long line of pilgrims who were to make their way to Camden from England and from various parts of America to pay their homage to the poet and, returning, to champion him and his cause. Edward Carpenter came in May, Edward Carpenter, whose Towards Democracy was to reflect not the genius but at least something of the spirit and method of Leaves of Grass. Long afterwards Carpenter described this meeting with Whitman. End of section 14. Section 15 of Whitman and Interpretation and Narrative by Emory Holloway. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Book 7, Part 2, The Long Afternoon. Meanwhile, in that first 10 minutes, I was becoming conscious of an impression which subsequently grew even more marked, the impression, namely, of immense vista or background in his personality. If I had thought before, and do not know that I had, that Whitman was eccentric, unbalanced, violent, my first interview certainly produced quite a contrary effect. No one could be more considerate, I may almost say courteous. No one could have more simplicity of manner and freedom from egotistical wrigglings, and I never yet met any one who gave me more the impression of knowing what he was doing than he did. Yet away and beyond all this, I was aware of a certain radiant power in him, a large benign effluence and inclusiveness as of the sun, which filled the place where he was, yet with something of reserve and sadness in it too, and a sense of remoteness and inaccessibility. In the autumn appeared a pilgrim from Canada, who was to be still more closely identified with Whitman's life and fame. This was Dr. Richard Maurice Bucke, of London, who had for years been reading Whitman's poetry. At first he had been puzzled and even antagonized by the strange verse, like Mrs. Johnston, who tells of having flung the book more than once through the top shelf of the bookcase with the determination to read it no more. But there was something in it which lured them both back, and made them eager to meet the author, in the hope of finding in his personality that which could only be suggested by his gnomic words. And both were won when they had seen him. In the case of Dr. Bucke, this was not due to any explanation Whitman chose to make of himself. Why should a man have to explain himself? Indeed, the poet spoke perhaps a scant 100 words. Yet Dr. Bucke was almost amazed by the beauty and majesty of his person and the gracious air of purity that surrounded him. He was himself a remarkable man and something of a mystic. He was at the time the head of an insane asylum in London and rated a good alienist. But though the meeting with Whitman seemed in every way commonplace and ordinary, it was the occasion of a mystical experience, which he described as comparable only to the slight intoxication of champagne or to falling in love. It seemed to me at that time certain that he was either actually a god or in some sense clearly and entirely preterhuman. It colored Buck's whole life and made him Whitman's friend, host, biographer, and literary executor. Indeed, it led him to write a book, Cosmic Consciousness, setting forth the opinion that those who could share the state of mind he discovered in Whitman were harbingers of a new stage of evolution. In all of this one will detect a certain ignorance of the history of religious experience and many personal limitations and predilections. Yet it is perhaps the most striking illustration of the power that Whitman sometimes had of revealing to others their own latent mystical faculties. The next year Whitman spent a month again with his friends, the Johnstons, who now lived opposite Central Park. The impulse to go to New York this time was due to his seeing in the paper an announcement of the death of his old friend William Cullen Bryant. In maintaining the sacerdotal dignity of the bards, they had much in common, and in their absorption in nature, their tendency to view mankind en masse. Whitman's fondness for individuals, however, gave him a greater range in poetizing, a greater warmth in human cheer. He belonged also as truly to the 19th century as Bryant belonged by temperament and training to the 18th. From New York, Whitman ventured on up the Hudson to enjoy a pleasant week with Burroughs. Returning, he loafed again in New York, meeting more of the young literati, and coming to see that, after all, he was not unknown or unhonored in his own country, his publishing failures to the contrary notwithstanding. The next year, 1879, he repeated his New York visit, this time the excuse being an invitation to deliver a lecture on the anniversary of Lincoln's assassination. Whitman had never failed to remember the day, but now he saw in its return an opportunity to add to his income by lecturing. He attempted to tell nothing new, or nor even to display any oratorical powers. Indeed, he sat as he read from a manuscript, yet the result of this trial lecture in an incommodious hall was such as to revive his old plan of lecturing regularly instead of depending on his pen. The Lincoln lecture was delivered each year for 13 years, often taking the form of a benefit for the lecturer. Especially was this the case in 1886 and 1887, when in Philadelphia and in New York he realized $600 or $700 from each reading. In the latter case, Andrew Carnegie sent a check for $350 for his box in the Madison Square Theater. Mark Twain was there, and St. Gaudens, Edmund Clarence Stedman, John Hay, General Sherman, and even James Russell Lowell, with whom he had had temperamentally so little in common. It was a tribute from his friends, and he was not more touched by the hotel reception which followed than he was by the appearance of Stedman's little daughter on the stage, presenting him a bouquet with the words, "Mr. Whitman, here are some lilacs that in our dooryard bloomed." As the old poet kissed her, the audience applauded. But to return to 1879, Whitman's steady regaining of his strength is apparent in the fact that this year he took a long journey to Colorado with some railroad friends, and the next year a still longer trip to visit Dr. Buck in Canada, and with him to explore the grandeurs of the Saguenay. The western trip was uneventful, except for the fact that it gave him his first sight of really grand mountains, between which and his own poems he fancied a genuine resemblance. In St. Louis he stopped with Jeff for a few months, doubtless recalling how much water had flowed down the Mississippi since his 1848 journey to New Orleans with his brother. The West was rapidly fulfilling the dream of his youth, reinforcing his cheerful faith in the future. And yet when he went to deliver his Lincoln lecture in Boston the next year, he was forced to admit that the East was just as progressive and in many ways retaining the preeminence of its early history. The city of Boston, for instance, was not the city he had seen in 1860. Old Boston, with its zigzag streets and multitudinous angles, crush up a sheet of letter paper in your hand, throw it down, stamp it flat, and that is a map of old Boston. New Boston, with its miles upon miles of large and costly houses, Beacon Street, Commonwealth Avenue, and 100 others. It was the Boston about which Howells was beginning to write with such pleasant clarity, the Howells who, as a young man, had been charmed by Whitman's cordial hand-clasp in the old days at Pfaff's on Broadway. During his visit, Whitman returned a visit Longfellow had paid the invalid in Camden 3 years before. Though in youth he had shared the fondness of the sentimental 1840s for Longfellow, when he set out on his own poetic mission he had striven to combat the Longfellow tradition as something too imitative for America. Now, having outgrown some of his self-consciousness, he puts himself on record as including Longfellow among the mighty four who stamped this first American century with its birthmarks of poetic literature. Emerson first, then Longfellow, Bryant, and Whittier. Longfellow he now praises for rich color, graceful forms and incidents, all that makes life beautiful and love refined, competing with the singers of Europe on their own ground, and with one exception, better and finer works than that of any of them. Apparently for the first time he saw the pictures of Millet at the home of Mr. Quincy Shaw, and recognized at once in them the expression of a kindred spirit, a method similar to his own. This visit probably had some connection with a letter which the poet received from a leading Boston publisher, J. R. Osgood, a few months later, proposing to bring out a new and complete Leaves of Grass. The reader will recall that Whitman had never had but one regular publisher, the unlucky firm of Thayer and Eldridge, whose business was ruined by the Civil War. To one who had been complaining for years of his neglect at the hands of editors and publishers, such a proposal, particularly when it came from Boston, must have taken him somewhat aback. Feeling that there might be some reservation in the mind of the publisher, Whitman replied that he would be glad to have his book published, was in fact preparing a new one-volume edition of his poems at the moment, but that he would countenance no expurgations or omissions. Thereupon the publisher asked to see the manuscript, which with many minor alterations and rearrangements was sent and accepted. Later in the year Whitman returned to Boston to see the book through the press with the same affectionate particularity that had marked its every edition. In Boston, Whitman spent much time under the elms of the Common, recalling the very words of the conversation with Emerson concerning the Children of Adam poems when he was preparing the 1860 edition. He perhaps had a premonition that he had not heard the last of those poems, and he had not, but at the time his mind was at peace and his hopes high. Selling books from his room in Camden was poor business at best, but a publisher like Osgood would not have taken the book unless he was sure of making money thereby for himself and for the author. During his stay, Whitman found time to run out to Concord for a short visit with his friend F. B. Sanborn. A private reception was held for him, which the Emersons attended. "Never had I a better piece of luck befall me," he wrote in his diary. "A long and blessed evening with Emerson, in a way I couldn't have wished better or different. For nearly 2 hours he had been placidly sitting where I could see his face in the best light, near me. Mrs. S.'s back parlor well filled with people, neighbors, many fresh and charming faces, women, mostly young, but some old. My friend A.B. Alcott and his daughter Louisa were there early. A good deal of talk. The subject, Henry Thoreau. Some new glints of his life and fortunes, with letters to and from him. One of the best by Margaret Fuller, others by Horace Greeley, Channing, etc. One from Thoreau himself, most quaint and interesting. No doubt I seemed very stupid to the room full of company, taking hardly any part in the conversation, but I had my own pail to milk in, as the Swiss proverb puts it. My seat and the relative arrangement were such that, without being rude or anything of the kind, I could just look squarely at E., which I did a good part of the 2 hours. On entering, he had spoken very briefly and politely to several of the company, then settled himself in his chair, a trifle pushed back, and, though a listener, and apparently an alert one, remained silent through the whole talk and discussion. A lady friend quietly took a seat next him to give special attention, a good color in his face, eyes clear with the well-known expression of sweetness, and the old clear, peering aspect quite the same. Better still was the next day when Emerson had Whitman and the Sanborns to dinner with other guests. Whitman looked upon this as symbolical of Emerson's unaltering approval of his work, as well as of himself, an interpretation which shows that even yet he was not quite indifferent to what the one-time master thought of him, or the value to himself as advertising of Emerson's endorsement. In another day he visited the manse, the battleground marked by French's Minutemen and Sleepy Hollow. I got out of the buggy and went up, of course, on foot, and stood a long while and pondered beside the near-together graves of Hawthorne and Thoreau. Thence to Walden Pond for another meditative hour, in which the poet carried his stone to add to the cairn which marks the spot of the hermit hut of Thoreau. It was like taking a farewell of many old friends, this Boston Concord trip, and within the year both Emerson and Longfellow were to precede him to that life beyond, concerning which his poems were more and more being composed. True to expectation, the new edition began with a brisk sale. By March, some 2,000 copies had been sold. Whitman's royalties, had they been paid, would have amounted to about $500. But in May broke a storm which he may have feared, though he could not have foreseen it. The book had come to the notice of the Society for the Suppression of Vice, for Massachusetts had then, as now, its Comstockian agency for dealing with such matters. This society complained to State Attorney General Marston, and he instructed the Boston District Attorney, Oliver Stevens, to take action more or less as a matter of routine. Stevens advised Osgood that the new book was subject to prosecution as falling within the provisions of the public statutes respecting obscene literature, and stating that if it were not suppressed by the publisher, action would have to be taken in the courts. Osgood, fearing the effect of such a prosecution on the reputation of his firm, asked Whitman if he were willing to cancel the passages alluded to. Again the poet was faced with the dilemma Emerson had presented 2 decades before. He realized that this might be his last book, and the solid gains he had so slowly effected with his poetic crusade were dear to the old and enfeebled man. Moreover, he stood in need of the royalties that were already mounting. Doubtless his experience with a world which loves nothing so much as compromise had taught him to respect worldly prudence and expediency a little more than he had in his inspired, self-confident youth. Perhaps he thought it a pity that he might not put himself on record entire without being forced in candor to hint experiences which were not to his credit. However, it was too late to live his life over, or to change the confessional character of his book. With all his faults, had he not learned more of life by living than the stoic and ascetic Emerson had discovered through contemplation? Nevertheless, he wrote Osgood that he would cancel some 10 lines and a half a dozen words and phrases, as in fact he had already done in earlier editions. But Stevens itemized more than 80 lines as the minimum of expurgation which would satisfy the law. This was too much mutilation for Whitman, whose book, it must be remembered, was his other self, and he rejected the proposition. He would not, as a compromise, even consent to eliminate the 2 poems, A Woman Waits for Me and To a Common Prostitute. There were other poems which in expression were more offensive to popular taste, but these 2 were, as we have seen, too personal for him to destroy them without qualms. The outcome of the matter was that, without hard feeling on the part of Whitman or his publisher, the plates were turned over to the poet in lieu of royalties. With them, Whitman at once issued a small edition himself, and then found in Rees, Welsh and Company of Philadelphia a publisher who was eager to stand a prosecution for the advertising value it would have. No legal action ensued, however, and even in Boston the postmaster received from Washington orders to revoke his order, including leaves of grass from the mails. This was due to the effective protest of Whitman's friend Talcott Williams, a young journalist of Philadelphia. Yet the sales were better than ever, an edition of 3,000 being sold in one day. The affair was the occasion of a partial reconciliation with O'Connor, who attacked Marston, Stevens, and Osgood without mercy in the press, as he had attacked Harlan 17 years before. O'Connor's The Good Gray Poet again appeared in print with a lengthy supplement in a biography of Whitman published the next year from the pen of Dr. Buck. This latter disciple worshipped his hero with such abandon, like Burroughs praising Leaves of Grass, as the Bible of democracy, that Whitman had to urge him to tone down many passages and to include criticisms of an adverse nature in order to give it an air of fairness. As in the case of Burroughs' notes, Whitman had a hand in the manuscript himself, writing many pages and sometimes altering the shading of others. In sending the manuscript back to Buck, he wrote, "The character you give me is not a true one in the main. I am by no means that benevolent, equable, good, happy creature you portray, but let that pass. I've left it as you wrote. Nevertheless, the book is full of information, documents, testimonials, which have ever since been of great value to biographers. Like the new edition of the Leaves, it was more or less what Whitman would have the world think of him. But Dr. Buck's book announced his greatness in too positive a fashion to stimulate the demand for his Leaves or the Specimen Days, also recently issued by David Mackay, successor to Rees Welsh. As his health improved and as he won the public endorsement of more and more prominent Americans, he was able to sell prose articles and poems to the magazines at good prices. For a time in 1888, he was paid $100 a month for regular brief contributions to the New York Herald, later collected in November Boughs. He continued his annual lectures on Lincoln, which, though he never popularly attended, were always the occasion of generous subscription from wealthy friends who wished thus to aid him. In 1885, at the suggestion of Mary Davis, his housekeeper, of whom we shall speak presently, Thomas Donaldson, a Philadelphia friend, invited such admirers of the poet as W. D. O'Connor, Horace Howard Furness, Talcott Williams, Charles Dudley Warner, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Richard Watson Gilder, Edwin Booth, and Mark Twain to subscribe $10 each for the purchase of a horse and buggy, now that Whitman was no longer able to get about on foot. A year or so later, an attempt was made to obtain for Whitman an invalid pension from the government on the basis of his war service. The bill was favorably reported, but Whitman declined to approve the measure, declaring he had not served for pay. In 1887, his friends in Boston, at the suggestion of William Sloane Kennedy, sent him $800 for the purpose of building him a cottage at Timber Creek. He was too feeble to make use of the gift in that way, however, and it was by agreement put to other uses. Still near the end of his life, Robert Ingersoll, being asked for a contribution for Whitman's nursing expenses, offered to deliver a benefit lecture on liberty and literature in Philadelphia. With the assistance of J. H. Johnston in making the arrangements, he did this, handing Whitman the proceeds, $869. English friends were equally liberal. Even the newspapers were solicitous, the New York Tribune taking up a subscription for flowers to cheer his sick room. But for all this, there was a time when Whitman was in dire poverty. George Whitman, prospering in business, determined to retire to the country, and in 1884 he built a commodious house at Burlington, New Jersey, designing a special room for Walt. But Whitman was sure that he was coming into his own as a poet, and wished to remain in town where he might keep in touch with people and affairs, and where he might continue to receive the many pilgrims who made Camden their Mecca. Even the offer to build him a separate shanty at Burlington, where he might continue his lifelong habits of irregularity without too great inconvenience to the household, did not persuade him. Moreover, he had saved the profits of his Rees Welsh edition to buy a house of his own. Before he could do this, his brother removed to the new house, and Whitman took a room in Camden. For some years before he had a publisher, he had been a familiar figure in Camden and Philadelphia, moving slowly along with a basket filled with his books on his arm, selling them as he could. This sight was in itself enough to provoke pity, and pity it did incite in the breast of a certain Mrs. Mary Davis, whose occupation in life seemed to be that of pitying and caring for others. From her rented house not far from Stephen Street she had often seen Whitman pass, though she had never met him. One frosty morning in the following winter, however, Whitman came to her door in need. She welcomed him to her neat and cheerful kitchen, laid breakfast before him, and charmed by his enthusiastic, hopeful child's heart, as she was touched by his need of a woman's care, she invited him to return. This he did, and gradually she took a more personal interest in him, mending his clothes, listening to his dreams of better days to come, nourishing him with excellent cooking. About this time Whitman bought for $1,750 a little old two-story house in Mickle Street, number 328, then a Whitman Museum at number 330 now. Mr. George W. Childs, the Philadelphia philanthropist, lent him the $500 he needed to close this purchase. But when he moved in, it was to a bare hermitage indeed, a bed, a goods box to write on, a table on which stood an oil stove to warm his milk. That was all. Even heat was wanting. Quite impossible. Such independence. And yet his first experiment, that of boarding with the former tenants in return for rent, was because of incompatibility still more impossible. But Whitman, the poetic pioneer, had the spirit and the training of the conquerors of the frontier. He would invite a visitor, no matter who, to dine with him in this scene of poverty, with no more apology than Francis Marion made for his diet of roasted potatoes. He was an old man, however, and ill, and such an abode obviously could not serve for long. Moreover, there was Mrs. Davis, paying rent and well supplied with furniture. Why not strike a bargain with her by which she should share his house, and in return equip it with her furniture and board him? She would not listen to such a proposal when it was made, but women, like most sentimentalists, had an eye to his own advantage in worldly matters, and he had persistency. And though he may not have known it, Mrs. Davis had had no training in protecting herself from the demands of those who saw the tenderness of her heart. Moreover, though she knew nothing about Whitman's poetry, nor could she, was, like stronger men and women than she, attracted by the man himself. The young sea captain she had secretly married had been drowned on his first voyage thereafter, the secrecy of their union preventing Mrs. Davis even from claiming his property, though other small legacies had given her enough to live on. Some years later, Whitman gave her a ring in token of his appreciation of her goodness to him. Did she place upon this a construction similar to that which had misled Mrs. Gilchrist? Those who do themselves injustice in too much Martha-like serving of others not infrequently find compensating desires gradually but unconsciously controlling their will. Did Mrs. Davis, after tending Whitman faithfully as a wife could have done, and without a wife's standing or prerogatives, live in hope that he would finally marry her so as to leave her the property which began to increase toward his death? We do not know, but we do know that she felt that she was bearing more than her share of the expenses and the work of the household, and we know that when Whitman's final will left her but $500 out of some $6,000 in the bequest, not counting his title to the house, she sued the estate for $5,000 more. That she had some law and some justice on her side is sufficiently indicated by the jury's award of $500. But that is to state the facts of the case too barely. We do not know the terms of the agreement except in a general way. We do not know, except from Mrs. Davis, that Whitman promised to share with her any increase in fortune he might have. We do know that she took him to care for when he was in great distress, and that she cared for him voluntarily at the cost of her strength, her property, and her own prospects. With a certain dislike of financial responsibility, and a certain childlike willingness to accept services or gifts without inquiring whether the service he himself had rendered the world would benefit the particular donors. Whitman combined also a marked Dutch thriftiness, which naturally increased with age. Not that he was penurious chiefly for himself. Every other month he paid the expenses of his imbecile brother Eddie, and he sent frequent sums to his sister in Vermont. Nevertheless, only a sense of business responsibility can save from disaster such arrangements as his with Mrs. Davis. Furthermore, there are indications that Mrs. Davis's emotions, not to say her affections, were involved, which made it harder for both either to continue or to break the arrangement when it appeared that they did not understand it in the same way. Whitman was at first looked upon in Camden by certain classes of the population as such a disreputable character, at least as the author of such an impossible book, that the village mind built up a kind of legend about him. It mattered little that he was on friendly terms with all classes of people. The children, for instance, would play on his cellar door under his window in hope of catching the pennies which occasionally would drop therefrom. So Mrs. Davis was in a measure ostracized by their unconventional though perfectly proper arrangement. Naturally, she subconsciously demanded compensation for that. One could wish that Whitman, who was generally so sensitive to the feelings of others, had taken the devotion of this woman less as a matter of course. He was appreciative, but a little aloof. Gradually he looked upon her as a housekeeper and friend, but the friend only increased the value of the capable housekeeper. Or did Whitman use this method of protecting both his independence and Mrs. Davis's feelings? He was, after all, something of a bohemian in his habits. His own family had never been able to make him regular in his hours, his meals, his plans. It was too much to hope that a woman who did not control his heart and was unable to enter into his intellectual life would do so. But the difficulty of the whole matter lay in the fact that while Whitman's increasing fame brought him more money, more visitors, and a greater sense of his importance, it brought Mrs. Davis more work, less authority in the house, and increased levies on her financial resources, for Whitman did not often defray the increased expenses due to his many guests. Given the two characters, injustice of a sort was certain to follow from such a bargain, and yet given the two characters as they were in that cheerless winter of 1884, that bargain was itself inevitable. The most serious weakness of Whitman's stoical philosophy lay in the fact that with him inevitability ended the matter. The irony of the story is appreciated only when it is known how many other homes were open or had been open to Whitman. Shortly after the war, a wealthy bachelor in New York had asked Whitman to share his apartments. A Philadelphia friend opened his home to him in these later years. Burroughs begged him to retire to Esopus at his expense, and the Johnstons in New York, seeing him in his poverty in Mickle Street, urged him to live with them where he could be cared for properly. And yet, with all the realistic details which Elizabeth Keller has so graphically pictured, and all the pathos, the last 7 years of Whitman's life were perhaps the most picturesque, as if his nature had at once bared itself of superfluities, the better to reveal its fundamental qualities, and at the same time had irresistibly called to its own. The very disorder in which he reigned was but a projection of one side of his mind, an old age replica of the newspaper offices in which he had spent his youth. The house was on a mean street not far from the ferry, the railway depot, and the streetcar line, so that there was much noise. Worse still, a guano factory near by contaminated the air with its odors. Of none of these things, however, did Whitman complain. In his backyard was a grapevine, a pear tree, and the lilacs which he loved. Before his window stood a single shade tree, under which he would sit on summer evenings. With Mrs. Davis's furniture and the accumulation of his own belongings, the house was crowded. Until too ill to descend the stairs, Whitman received callers in the front room on the first floor, which was cluttered with unsold copies of early editions of his books. Dining room and kitchen were one, but crowded only as a ship's cabin is crowded neatly. His bedroom was upstairs at the front, a large room, where between two north windows the poet would sit in an immense cane-seated chair draped with a wolfskin. On one side of the room stood an immense wooden bed, none too comfortable, and opposite it a sheet iron stove. An ancient trunk and sundry boxes hoarded the manuscripts which are today so useful in tracing his literary history, as well as many personal relics, for while Whitman might give away such things, he could not destroy them. Everywhere else, as visitors have testified, was a litter of books, newspapers, manuscripts, printers' proofs on the chairs, on the table, overflowing the waste baskets, covering the floor, and even spreading out under the washstand and the bed. From this litter Whitman seemed to be able to fish up with his cane almost anything that was wanted. The mantel was equally crowded with photographs of his friends, while paintings of his father and his mother, and another of the Indian chief Osceola, partly hid the cheap and ugly wallpaper. Here ruled Walt Whitman until his last days, never suffering the profanation of the broom. He had kept his independence when he had forsworn marriage in youth. Now he was the victim of it. He had been in the little house about a year when news came of the death of Mrs. Gilchrist. Their correspondence since her return to England showed how constant was their friendship, how high their regard for each other. Whitman's last letter to her she never received, it being mailed 8 days after her death, but to her son he wrote, on receipt of the shocking news, "I have received your letter. Nothing now remains but a sweet and rich memory, none more beautiful, all time, all life, all the earth. I cannot write anything of a letter today. I must sit alone and think." But a little later he wrote the poem Going Somewhere as a memorial to her. The theme was immortality, concerning which he was thinking more and more. To Ingersoll, the agnostic, he said concerning the afterlife, "Well, Robert, I don't know for anybody but myself, but for myself I'm as certain of it as I am that we are all here." Through mystical ecstasy he had sought union with the cosmos itself, and now he felt that he could perish no more than the deity of whom he knew himself a part. Only a year or so before, at Cape May, he had written a poem as suggestive of this union as any he had ever penned. With husky, haughty lips, O sea, where day and night I wend thy surf-beat shore, imaging to myself thy varied, strange suggestions. I see and plainly list thy talk and conference here, thy troops of white-maned racers racing to the goal, thy ample smiling face dashed with the sparkling dimples of the sun, thy brooding scowls and murk, thy unloosed hurricanes, thy unsubduedness, caprices, wilfulness, great as thou art above the rest, thy many tears, alack from all eternity in thy content, naught but the greatest struggles, wrongs, defeats could make thee greatest, no less could make thee thy lonely state something thou ever seek'st and seek'st, yet never gainst. Surely some right withheld, some voice in huge monotonous rage, a freedom lover pent. Some vast heart, like a planet's chained and chafing in those breakers, by lengthened swell and spasm, and panting breath, and rhythmic rasping of thy sands and waves, and serpent hiss, and savage peals of laughter, and undertones of distant lion roar, sounding, appealing to the sky's deaf ear, but now rapport for once, a phantom in the night, thy confidant for once, the first and last confession of the globe, outsurging, muttering from thy soul's abysms, this tale of cosmic elemental passion thou tellest to a kindred soul. It is no marvel that one who could feel such a kinship with nature should be able to remind other men and women of their deeper selves. In his last years Whitman was to have not only the readers for whom he had waited so long, but personal friends who honored themselves in easing his last years and ensuring a home which otherwise must have been a prison. Burroughs and Buck and Johnston and Rossetti remained faithful to him. To their ranks were added many younger men in Boston and Philadelphia in England. At Bolton, England was a group whose chief tie was a devotion to Whitman and his writings. In Philadelphia was Thomas B. Harned, a prosperous lawyer and a lover of literature, who not only entertained Whitman at his home when the latter was able to make the journey, but supplied him with delicacies which gave him professional assistance when needed. Talcott Williams and Francis Howard Williams, a poet and journalist, did much for Whitman through the local press. Horace Traubel, the most active of them all, had known Whitman ever since the days when, as a boy, he had lingered at the doorstep of the Stevens Street house to discuss with him the books he had been reading, impressed from the first less by his prophetic role than by his human attractiveness, a large man of generous nature, magnetic beyond speech. When Whitman moved to his shack, as he called it, and before he had a housekeeper, Traubel would go by after office hours to assist him in preparing his meals, or to run on errands to the printer. Only Boswell has shown such devotion, and Boswell's devotion was not so practical or so independent. To one who had given so long a proof of affection to the poet and his poetry, Whitman gratefully entrusted many manuscripts, documents, confidences. With Dr. Buck and Harned, Traubel was to be Whitman's literary executor, and Whitman received the ardent young disciple evening after evening for years, knowing that he would make notes of their discussions for use in a voluminous diary to be published when the poet was gone. The subject of these conversations are too varied to be adequately gone into here. They reveal nothing new in Whitman's character, of course, and the light they shed on his influence belongs in a volume to which I have referred as needing yet to be written, tracing that influence in full. A list of others who came to Mickle Street and went away happy, often to set down their impression of one of the most striking men America has ever produced, is such as few poets can match. Thomas Aikins, Herbert Gilchrist, and Alexander came to paint him as Waters and Charles Hine had done before. Sidney Morse was busy for weeks in his backyard making a bust. Edmund Gosse and Bram Stoker, Ernest Rhys and Justin McCarthy, Dr. Johnston of the Bolton Group, and Oscar Wilde, Joaquin Miller, and Sir Edwin Arnold all paid their respects. Sir Edwin surprised Whitman by offering to quote from memory any one of Whitman's poems which the latter would select. These names must suggest the quality of his influence on those who had opportunity to judge the man as well as of his work. Not all thought that the work did complete justice to the man. Few thought the man inferior to what he had written. In June 1888, Whitman one day sent Mrs. Davis to summon his horse and buggy from the livery stable, and after a long drive turned to the river to watch the setting sun. Lost in reverie, he remained motionless till thoroughly chilled by the damps of evening. This was the beginning of a new paralytic shock, rendering him for the time speechless and putting an end to his rides altogether. A wheelchair was substituted, but was also necessary for him to have a nurse, a man to push it and to care for him at home. Without consulting Whitman, Traubel, and Harned organized a group of Whitman's admirers, who regularly contributed to a fund for the expenses of this nurse, not desisting when his expected death was delayed 4 years. A will was made as in Washington, but Whitman had both the determination to live and remarkable physical stamina. In that same year, indeed, he succeeded, with Traubel's assistance, in bringing out November Boughs, a collection of prose and poetry which had already appeared in print. The next year saw a new edition of the Leaves, with some alterations, the November Boughs poems appearing now as Sends at 70, and with the preface-like essay, A Backward Glance O'er Travelled Roads, second in importance only to the preface to the first edition. On Christmas, 1890, in the evening, Whitman was visited by Thomas Donaldson. The poet spoke of the way he had spent the afternoon in selecting a site for his tomb, the owners of Harley Cemetery having offered to present him with one. "Well, cheerful occupation, eh?" replied Donaldson. "Yes, yes," said Walt. "Still we must get ready. But I am not going to die yet awhile," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "only getting the case ready for this old hulk. I'm offered any location I like. I've picked out a bit of a hill with a southern exposure among the trees. I like to be with the trees. Yes, I think I've selected a comfortable grave." The tomb, though simple, was to be impressive as well as comfortable, and Whitman was to have use for it as soon as it was completed. It was to be a family vault to which the bodies of his parents and his brothers, Jeff had died a month before, were to be removed. It was massive granite, unhewn, blending into the side of the hill. But it was far more expensive than Whitman had been led to believe, and even the $2,500 which he finally paid, plus a considerable sum which Harned quietly added, represented a reduction from the exorbitant demands whereby the unscrupulous builder sought to impose on the sometimes simple old man. By a singular coincidence, the same charge of egotism which was provoked by his first edition was raised against his saving money, at times sorely needed for this tomb. Even Mary Davis, who was willing to serve and to wait while he lived, and who seemed more broken-hearted than even his relatives when he died, thought that with this money might with more justice have been willed to her. To her, Whitman, the poet, meant little, and his significance to later generations still less. In April of the next year, Whitman was able to be wheeled over to Philadelphia to deliver his last tribute to Lincoln, though not without a great exertion. On his birthday, his friends, feeling that it would be impossible for him to have a dinner at Ricer's restaurant, as on the previous year, brought in a caterer and made room for a banquet in his own home. The next day Whitman wrote Dr. John Johnston the following letter, with the request that it be reproduced in facsimile and forwarded to those who had sent felicitations on his birthday the evening before. "Well, here I am, launched on my 73rd year. We had our birth anniversary spree last evening. About 40 people, choice friends mostly, 12 or so women." Tennyson sent a short and sweet letter over his own sign manual. "Your cable was received and read. Lots of bits of speeches with gems in them. We had a capital supper or dinner, chicken soup, salmon, roast lamb, etc., etc., etc. I'd been under a horrible spell from 5 to 6, but Wary got me dressed and down, like carrying down a great log, and Traubel had all ready for me, a big goblet of first-rate iced champagne. I suppose I swigged it off at once. I certainly welcomed them all forthwith, and at once felt if I was to go down I would not fail without a desperate struggle. Must have drunk near 2 bottles of champagne the evening, so I added I felt to a few words of honor and reverence for our Emerson, Bryant, Longfellow dead, and then for Whittier and Tennyson, the boss of us all, specifying all. Not 4 minutes altogether. Then held out with them for 3 hours, talking lots impromptu. Dr. B. is here. Horace T. is married. Fine sunny noon." In December he was bedfast with pneumonia. Dr. Buck came down from London and arranged for a trained nurse to care for the patient. The physicians who attended him at various times, Doctors Longacre, Ostler, and McAllister, not to mention Dr. Buck, never presented bills for their services. Though Whitman was suffering from pneumonia, pleurisy, tuberculosis, and other ailments, he did not die at once, as even the physicians expected, but he knew that he could not get well. In fact, he had known for a year that his end and the end of his singing was approaching. In March he had brought out a little book to say farewell to his muse. It was without any fire of inspiration, but showed him unflinching in his desire and determination to put his entire life into his book. And now, incorporating these old age poems in a second annex, he would bring out a final edition of the Leaves of Grass. Traubel had to superintend much of the work. Even so, it appeared that the book would have to be posthumously published, but the printer was urged to rush the binding of a limited number of copies, that the dying poet might send them as a farewell gift to his many friends. The deathbed edition, this was called. As the end drew near, he felt neither fear nor reluctance to go, nor did he even lose his quiet sense of humor. "Well, doctors, what is the verdict?" he would ask, adding, by way of explanation for the question, "It would be a satisfaction to know how the cat is going to jump." On March 26th he passed away to join his fancy. "Good-bye, my fancy. Farewell, dear mate, dear love. I'm going away, I know not where, or to what fortune, or whether I may ever see you again. So good-bye, my fancy. Now for my last. Let me look back a moment. The slower, fainter ticking of the clock is in me. Exit, nightfall, and soon the heart thud stopping. Long have we lived, joyed, caressed together. Delightful. Now separation. Good-bye, my fancy. Yet let me not be too hasty. Long indeed have we lived, slept, filtered, become really blended into one. Then if we die together, yes, we'll remain one. If we go anywhere, we'll go together to meet what happens. Maybe we'll be better off and blither, and learn something. Maybe it is yourself now really ushering me to the true songs. Who knows? Maybe it is you, the mortal knob, really undoing, turning. So now finally good-bye, and hail, my fancy. End of section 15. End of Whitman, An Interpretation in Narrative by Emory Holloway.